The Cloak, a short story by Nikolai Gogol. In the department of... But it is better not to mention the department. The touchiest things in the world are departments, regiments, courts of justice, in a word, all branches of public service. Each individual nowadays thinks all society insulted in his person. Quite recently, a complaint was received from a district chief of police in which he plainly demonstrated that all the imperial institutions were going to the dogs and that the Tsar's sacred name was being taken in vain. And in proof, he appended to the complaint a romance in which the district chief of police is made to appear about once in every 10 pages and sometimes in a downright drunken condition. Therefore, in order to avoid all unpleasantness, it will be better to designate the department in question as a certain department. So, in a certain department, there was a certain official, not a very notable one, it must be allowed, short of stature, somewhat pockmarked, red-haired and mole-eyed, with a bald forehead, wrinkled cheeks, and a complexion of the kind known as sanguine. The Saint Petersburg climate was responsible for this. As for his official rank, with us Russians the rank comes first, he was what is called a perpetual titular councillor, over which, as is well known, some writers make merry and crack their jokes, obeying the praiseworthy custom of attacking those who cannot bite back. His family name was Bashmachkin. This name is evidently derived from bashmak, shoe, but when, at what time, and in what manner, is not known. His father and grandfather and all the Bashmachkins always wore boots, which were resoled 2 or 3 times a year. His name was Akaky Akakievich. It may strike the reader as rather singular and far-fetched, but he may rest assured that it was by no means far-fetched, and that the circumstances were such that it would have been impossible to give him any other. This was how it came about. Akaky Akakievich was born, if my memory fails me not, in the evening on the 23rd of March. His mother, the wife of a government official and a very fine woman, made all due arrangements for having the child baptized. She was lying on the bed opposite the door. On her right stood the godfather, Ivan Ivanovich Eroshkin, a most estimable man who served as the head clerk of the Senate, and the godmother, Arina Semyonovna Bielobrinskova, the wife of an officer of the quarter and a woman of rare virtues. They offered the mother her choice of 3 names, Mokia, Sosia, or that the child should be called after the martyr Kozdazat. "No," said the good woman, "all those names are poor." In order to please her, they opened the calendar at another place. 3 more names appeared, Trifoli, Dula, and Varakasi. "This is awful," said the old woman. "What names! I truly never heard the like. I might have put up with Varadat or Varuk, but not Trifoli and Varakasi." They turned to another page and found Pavsikaki and Vaktisi. "Now I see," said the old woman, "that it is plainly fate. And since such is the case, it will be better to name him after his father. His father's name was Akaky, so let his son's name be Akaky too." In this manner he became Akaky Akakievich. They christened the child, whereat he wept and made a grimace, as though he foresaw that he was to be a titular councillor. In this manner did it all come about. We have mentioned it in order that the reader might see for himself that it was a case of necessity, and that it was utterly impossible to give him any other name. When and how he entered the department, and who appointed him, no one could remember. However much the directors and chiefs of all kinds were changed, he was always to be seen in the same place, the same attitude, the same occupation, always the letter-copying clerk, so that it was afterwards affirmed that he had been born in uniform with a bald head. No respect was shown him in the department. The porter not only did not rise from his seat when he passed, but never even glanced at him, any more than if a fly had flown through the reception room. His superiors treated him in coolly despotic fashion. Some insignificant assistant to the head clerk would thrust a paper under his nose without so much as saying, "Copy," or "Here's an interesting little case," or anything else agreeable, as is customary amongst well-bred officials. And he took it, looking only at the paper and not observing who handed it to him or whether he had the right to do so, simply took it and set about copying it. The young officials laughed at and made fun of him so far as their official wit permitted, told in his presence various stories concocted about him and about his landlady, an old woman of 70, declared that she beat him, asked when the wedding was to be, and strewed bits of paper over his head, calling them snow. But Akaki Akakievich answered not a word, any more than if there had been no one there besides himself. It even had no effect upon his work. Amid all these annoyances, he never made a single mistake in a letter. But if the joking became wholly unbearable, as when they jogged his head and prevented his attending to his work, he would exclaim, "Leave me alone! Why do you insult me?" And there was something strange in the words and the voice in which they were uttered. There was in it something which moved to pity, so much so that one young man, a newcomer, who, taking pattern by the others, had permitted himself to make sport of Akaki, suddenly stopped short, as though all about him had undergone a transformation and presented itself in a different aspect. Some unseen force repelled him from the comrades whose acquaintance he had made, on the supposition that they were decent, well-bred men. Long afterwards, in his gayest moments, there recurred to his mind the little official with the bald forehead, with his heart-rending words, "Leave me alone! Why do you insult me?" In these moving words other words resounded, "I am thy brother." And the young man covered his face with his hand, and many a time afterwards, in the course of his life, shuddered at seeing how much inhumanity there is in man, how much savage coarseness is concealed beneath refined, cultured, worldly refinement, and even, O God, in that man whom the world acknowledges as honorable and upright. It would be difficult to find another man who lived so entirely for his duties. It is not enough to say that Akaki labored with zeal. No, he labored with love. In his copying, he found a varied and agreeable employment. Enjoyment was written on his face. Some letters were even favorites with him. And when he encountered these, he smiled, winked, and worked with his lips, till it seemed as though each letter might be read in his face as his pen traced it. If his pay had been in proportion to his zeal, he would, perhaps, to his great surprise, have been made even a councillor of state. But he worked, as his companions the wits put it, like a horse in a mill. However, it would be untrue to say that no attention was paid to him. One director, being a kindly man and desirous of rewarding him for his long service, ordered him to be given something more important than mere copying. So he was ordered to make a report of an already concluded affair to another department, the duty consisting simply in changing the heading and altering a few words from the first to the third person. This caused him so much toil that he broke into a perspiration, rubbed his forehead, and finally said, "No, give me rather something to copy." After that, they let him copy on forever. Outside this copying, it appeared that nothing existed for him. He gave no thought to his clothes. His uniform was not green, but a sort of rusty meal colour. The collar was low, so that his neck, in spite of the fact that it was not long, seemed inordinately so as it emerged from it, like the necks of the plaster cats which peddlers carry about on their heads. And something was always sticking to his uniform, either a bit of hay or some trifle. Moreover, he had a peculiar knack, as he walked along the street, of arriving beneath a window just as all sorts of rubbish was being flung out of it. Hence, he always bore about on his hat scraps of melon rinds and other such articles. Never once in his life did he give heed to what was going on every day to the street, while it is well known that his young brother officials trained the range of their glances till they could see when anyone's trouser straps came undone upon the opposite sidewalk, which always brought a malicious smile to their faces. But Akaki Akakievich saw in all things the clean, even strokes of his written lines, and only when a horse thrust his nose from some unknown quarter over his shoulder and sent a whole gust of wind down his neck from his nostrils, did he observe that he was not in the middle of a line, but in the middle of the street. On reaching home, he sat down at once at the table, sipped his cabbage soup up quickly, and swallowed a bit of beef with onions, never noticing their taste, and gulping down everything with flies and anything else which the Lord happened to send at the moment. When he saw that his stomach was beginning to swell, he rose from the table and copied papers which he had brought home. If there happened to be none, he took copies for himself, for his own gratification, especially if the document was noteworthy, not on account of its style, but of its being addressed to some distinguished person. Even at the hour when the grey St. Petersburg sky had quite disappeared, and all the official world had eaten or dined, each as he could, in accordance with the salary he received and his own fancy, when all were resting from the department jar of pens, running to and fro for their own and other people's indispensable occupations, and from all the work that an uneasy man makes willingly for himself rather than what is necessary, when officials hasten to dedicate to pleasure the time which is left to them, one bolder than the rest, going to the theatre, another into the street looking under the bonnets, another wasting his evening in compliments to some pretty girl, the star of a small official circle, another, and this is the common case of all, visiting his comrades on the third or fourth floor, in two small rooms with an ante-room or kitchen, and some pretensions to fashion, such as a lamp or some other trifle which has cost many a sacrifice of dinner or pleasure trip. In a word, at the hour when all officials disperse among the contracted quarters of their friends to play whist as they sip their tea from glasses with a kopek's worth of sugar, smoke long pipes, relate at times some bits of gossip which a Russian man can never, under any circumstances, refrain from, and when there is nothing else to talk of, repeat eternal anecdotes about the commandant to whom they had sent word that the tails of the horses on the Falconet Monument had been cut off. When all strive to divert themselves, Akaky Akakievitch indulged in no kind of diversion. No one could even say that he had seen him at any kind of evening party. Having written to his heart's content, he lay down to sleep, smiling at the thought of the coming day, of what God might send him to copy on the morrow. Thus flowed on the peaceful life of the man, who, with a salary of 400 roubles, understood how to be content with his lot. And thus it would have continued to flow on, perhaps, to extreme old age, were it not that there are various ills strewn along the path of life for titular councillors, as well as for private, actual, court, and every other species of councillor, even to those who never give any advice or take any themselves. There exists in St. Petersburg a powerful foe of all who receive a salary of 400 roubles a year, or thereabouts. This foe is no other than the northern cold, although it is said to be very healthy. At 9 o'clock in the morning, at the very hour when the streets are filled with men bound for the various official departments, it begins to bestow such powerful and piercing nips on all noses impartially that the poor officials really do not know what to do with them. At an hour when the foreheads of even those who occupy exalted positions ache with the cold and tears start to their eyes, the poor titular councillors are sometimes quite unprotected. Their only salvation lies in traversing as quickly as possible in their thin little cloaks 5 or 6 streets, and then warming their feet in the porter's room, and so thawing all their talents and qualifications for official service which had become frozen on the way. Akaky Akakievitch had felt for some time that his back and shoulders were paining with peculiar poignancy, in spite of the fact that he tried to traverse the distance with all possible speed. He began finally to wonder whether the fault did not lie in his cloak. He examined it thoroughly at home, and discovered that in 2 places, namely, on the back and shoulders, it had become thin as gauze. The cloth was worn to such a degree that he could see through it, and the lining had fallen into pieces. You must know that Akaky Akakiyevitch's cloak served as an object of ridicule to the officials. They even refused it the noble name of cloak and called it a cape. In fact, it was of singular make, its collar diminishing year by year to serve to patch its other parts. The patching did not exhibit great skill on the part of the tailor, and was, in fact, baggy and ugly. Seeing how the matter stood, Akaki Akakievich decided that it would be necessary to take the cloak to Petrovich, the tailor, who lived somewhere on the fourth floor up a dark staircase, and who, in spite of his having but one eye and pockmarks all over his face, busied himself with considerable success in repairing the trousers and coats of officials and others. That is to say, when he was sober and not nursing some other scheme in his head. It is not necessary to say much about this tailor, but as it is the custom to have the character of each personage in a novel clearly defined, there is no help for it. So here is Petrovich, the tailor. At first he was called only Grigory, and was some gentleman's serf. He commenced calling himself Petrovich from the time when he received his free papers, and further began to drink heavily on all holidays, at first on the great ones, and then on all church festivals without discrimination, wherever a cross stood in the calendar. On this point he was faithful to ancestral custom, and when quarrelling with his wife, he called her a low female and a German. As we have mentioned his wife, it will be necessary to say a word or two about her. Unfortunately, little is known of her beyond the fact that Petrovich had a wife who wore a cap and a dress, but could not lay claim to beauty. At least, no one but the soldiers of the guard even looked under her cap when they met her. Ascending the staircase which led to Petrovich's room, which staircase was all soaked with dishwater and reeked with the smell of spirits which affects the eyes, and is an inevitable adjunct to all dark stairways in Saint Petersburg houses. Ascending the stairs, Akaki Akakievich pondered how much Petrovich would ask, and mentally resolved not to give more than 2 rubles. The door was open, for the mistress, in cooking some fish, had raised such a smoke in the kitchen that not even the beetles were visible. Akaki Akakievich passed through the kitchen unperceived, even by the housewife, and at length reached a room where he beheld Petrovich seated on a large unpainted table, with his legs tucked under him like a Turkish pasha. His feet were bare, after the fashion of tailors as they sit at work, and the first thing which caught the eye was his thumb, with a deformed nail thick and strong as a turtle's shell. About Petrovich's neck hung a skein of silk and thread, and upon his knees lay some old garment. He had been trying unsuccessfully for 3 minutes to thread his needle, and was enraged at the darkness, and even at the thread, growling in a low voice, "It won't go through, the barbarian! You pricked me, you rascal!" Akaki Akakievich was vexed at arriving at the precise moment when Petrovich was angry. He liked to order something of Petrovich when he was a little downhearted, or, as his wife expressed it, when he had settled himself with brandy, the one-eyed devil. Under such circumstances, Petrovich generally came down in his price very readily, and even bowed and returned thanks. Afterwards, to be sure, his wife would come, complaining that her husband had been drunk and so had fixed the price too low. But if only a 10 kopeck piece were added, then the matter would be settled. But now it appeared that Petrovich was in a sober condition, and therefore rough, taciturn, and inclined to demand, Satan only knows what price. Akaki Akakievich felt this, and would gladly have beat a retreat, but he was in for it. Petrovich screwed up his one eye very intently at him, and Akaki Akakievich involuntarily said, "How do you do, Petrovich?" "I wish you a good morning, sir," said Petrovich, squinting at Akaki Akakievich's hands to see what sort of booty he had brought. "Ah, to you, Petrovich, this—" It must be known that Akaki Akakievich expressed himself chiefly by prepositions, adverbs, and scraps of phrases which had no meaning whatever. If the matter was a very difficult one, he had a habit of never completing his sentences, so that frequently, having begun a phrase with the words, "This, in fact, is quite," he forgot to go on, thinking he had already finished it. "What is it?" asked Petrovich, and with his one eye scanned Akaki Akakievich's whole uniform from the collar down to the cuffs, the back, the tails, and the buttonholes, all of which were well known to him, since they were his own handiwork. Such is the habit of tailors. It is the first thing they do on meeting one. But I hear this, Petrovich, a cloak, cloth. Here you see everywhere, in different places. It is quite strong. It is a little dusty and looks old, but it is new. Only here in one place it is a little on the back, and here on one of the shoulders. It is a little worn, yes. Here on this shoulder it is a little. Do you see? That is all. And a little work. Petrovich took the cloak, spread it out, to begin with, on the table, looked at it hard, shook his head, reached out his hand to the window-sill for his snuff-box, adorned with the portrait of some general, though what general is unknown, for the place where the face should have been had been rubbed through by the finger, and a square bit of paper had been pasted over it. Having taken a pinch of snuff, Petrovich held up the cloak and inspected it against the light, and again shook his head. Then he turned it, lining upwards, and shook his head once more. After which he again lifted the general adorned lid with its bit of pasted paper, and having stuffed his nose with snuff, dosed and put away the snuff-box, and said finally, "No, it is impossible to mend it. It is a wretched garment." Akaky Akakievich's heart sank at these words. "Why is it impossible, Petrovich?" he said, almost in the pleading voice of a child. "All that ails it is that it is worn on the shoulders. You must have some pieces." "Yes, patches could be found. Patches are easily found," said Petrovich, "but there's nothing to sew them to. The thing is completely rotten. If you put a needle to it, see, it will give way. Let it give way, and you can put on another patch at once. But there is nothing to put the patches onto. There's no use in strengthening it. It is too far gone. It's lucky that it's cloth, for if the wind were to blow, it would fly away. Well, strengthen it again. How this, in fact?" "No," said Petrovich decisively. "There is nothing to be done with it. It's a thoroughly bad job. You'd better, when the cold winter weather comes on, make yourself some gaiters out of it, because stockings are not warm. The Germans invented them in order to make more money." Petrovich loved on all occasions to have a fling at the Germans, but it is plain you must have a new cloak. At the word new, all grew dark before Akaky Akakievich's eyes, and everything in the room began to whirl round. The only thing he saw clearly was the general with the paper face on the lid of Petrovich's snuff-box. "A new one," said he, as if still in a dream. "Why, I have no money for that." "Yes, a new one," said Petrovich, with barbarous composure. "Well, if it came to a new one, how it, You mean how much would it cost?" "Yes." "Well, you would have to lay out 150 or more," said Petrovich, and pursed up his lips significantly. He liked to produce powerful effects, liked to stun utterly and suddenly, and then to glance sideways to see what face the stunned person would put on the matter. 150 roubles for a cloak!" shrieked poor Akaky Akakievich, perhaps for the first time in his life, for his voice had always been distinguished for softness. "Yes, sir," said Petrovich, "for any kind of cloak. If you have a marten fur on the collar or a silk-lined hood, it will mount up to 200. "Petrovich, please," said Akaky Akakievich in a beseeching tone, not hearing and not trying to hear Petrovich's words and disregarding all his effects. "Some repairs, in order that it may wear yet a little longer." "No, it would only be a waste of time and money," said Petrovich, and Akaky Akakievich went away after these words, utterly discouraged. But Petrovich stood for some time after his departure, with significantly compressed lips, and without betaking himself to his work, satisfied that he would not be dropped, and an artistic tailor employed. Akaky Akakievich went out into the street as if in a dream. "Such an affair," he said to himself. "I did not think it had come to—" And then, after a pause, he added, "Well, so it is. See what it has come to at last, and I never imagined that it was so." Then followed a long silence, after which he exclaimed, "Well, so it is. See what already, nothing unexpected, that it would be nothing. What a strange circumstance." So saying, instead of going home, he went in exactly the opposite direction, without suspecting it. On the way, a chimney sweep bumped up against him and blackened his shoulder, and a whole hatful of rubbish landed on him from the top of a house which was building. He did not notice it, and only when he ran against a watchman who, having planted his halberd beside him, was shaking some snuff from his box into his horny hand, did he recover himself a little, and that because the watchman said, "Why are you poking yourself into a man's very face? Haven't you the pavement?" This caused him to look about him and turn towards home. There only, he finally began to collect his thoughts and to survey his position in its clear and actual light, and to argue with himself, sensibly and frankly, as with a reasonable friend, with whom one can discuss private and personal matters. "No," said Akaky Akakievitch, "it is impossible to reason with Petrovitch now. He is that. Evidently his wife has been beating him. I'd better go to him on Sunday morning. After Saturday night he will be a little cross-eyed and sleepy, for he will want to get drunk, and his wife won't give him any money, and at such a time a 10-kopeck piece in his hand he will become more fit to reason with, and then the cloak and that." Thus argued Akaky Akakievitch with himself, regained his courage, and waited until the first Sunday, when, seeing from afar that Petrovitch's wife had left the house, he went straight to him. Petrovitch's eye was indeed very much askew after Saturday. His head drooped, and he was very sleepy. But for all that, as soon as he knew what it was a question of, it seemed as though Satan jogged his memory. "Impossible," said he. "Please to order a new one." Thereupon Akaky Akakievitch handed over the 10-kopeck piece. "Thank you, sir. I will drink your good health," said Petrovitch. "But as for the cloak, don't trouble yourself about it. It is good for nothing. I will make you a capital new one, so let us settle about it now." Akaky Akakievitch was still for mending it, but Petrovitch would not hear of it, and said, "I shall certainly have to make you a new one, and you may depend upon it that I shall do my best. It may even be, as the fashion goes, that the collar can be fastened by silver hooks under a flap." Then Akaky Akakievitch saw that it was impossible to get along without a new cloak, and his spirits sank utterly. How, in fact, was it to be done? Where was the money to come from? He must have some new trousers and pay a debt of long standing to the shoemaker for putting new tops to his old boots, and he must order 3 shirts from the seamstress and a couple of pieces of linen. In short, all his money must be spent, and even if the director should be so kind as to order him to receive 45 or even 50 roubles instead of 40, it would be a mere nothing, a mere drop in the ocean towards the funds necessary for a cloak, although he knew that Petrovitch was often wrong-headed enough to blurt out some outrageous price, so that even his own wife could not refrain from exclaiming, "Have you lost your senses, you fool?" At one time he would not work at any price, and now it was quite likely that he had named a higher sum than the cloak would cost. But although he knew that Petrovitch would undertake to make a cloak for 80 roubles, still, where was he to get the 80 roubles from? He might possibly manage half. Yes, half might be procured, but where was the other half to come from? But the reader must first be told where the first half came from. Akaky Akakievitch had a habit of putting, for every rouble he spent, a groschen into a small box, fastened with lock and key, and with a slit in the top for the reception of money. At the end of every half-year he counted over the heap of coppers and changed it for silver. This he had done for a long time, and in the course of years the sum had mounted up to over 40 roubles. Thus he had one half on hand. But where was he to find the other half? Where was he to get another 40 roubles from? Akaky Akakievitch thought, and decided that it would be necessary to curtail his ordinary expenses, for the space of 1 year at least, to dispense with tea in the evening, to burn no candles, and, if there was anything which he must do, to go into his landlady's room and work by her light. When he went into the street, he must walk as lightly as he could, and as cautiously upon the stones, almost upon tiptoe, in order not to wear his heels down in too short a time. He must give the laundress as little to wash as possible, and in order not to wear out his clothes, He must take them off as soon as he got home and wear only his cotton dressing gown, which had been long and carefully saved. To tell the truth, it was a little hard for him at first to accustom himself to these deprivations, but he got used to them at length, after a fashion, and all went smoothly. He even got used to being hungry in the evening, but he made up for it by treating himself, so to say, in spirit, by bearing ever in mind the idea of his future cloak. From that time forth, his existence seemed to become, in some way, fuller, as if he were married, or as if some other man lived in him, as if, in fact, he were not alone, and some pleasant friend had consented to travel along life's path with him, the friend being no other than the cloak, with thick wadding and a strong lining, incapable of wearing out. He became more lively, and even his character grew firmer, like that of a man who has made up his mind and set himself a goal. From his face and gait, doubt and indecision, all hesitating and wavering, disappeared of themselves. Fire gleamed in his eyes, and occasionally the boldest and most daring ideas flitted through his mind. Why not, for instance, have marten fur on the collar? The thought of this almost made him absent-minded. Once, in copying a letter, he nearly made a mistake, so that he exclaimed almost aloud, "Ugh!" and crossed himself. Once, in the course of every month, he had a conference with Petrovitch on the subject of the cloak, where it would be better to buy the cloth, and the colour, and the price. He always returned home satisfied, though troubled, reflecting that the time would come at last when it could all be bought, and then the cloak made. The affair progressed more briskly than he had expected, for beyond all his hopes, the director awarded neither 40 nor 45 rubles for Akaky Akakiyevitch's share, but 60. Whether he suspected that Akaky Akakiyevitch needed a cloak, or whether it was merely chance, at all events, 20 extra rubles were by this means provided. This circumstance hastened matters. 2 or 3 months more of hunger, and Akaky Akakiyevitch had accumulated about 80 rubles. His heart, generally so quiet, began to throb. On the first possible day, he went shopping in company with Petrovitch. They bought some very good cloth, and at a reasonable rate too, for they had been considering the matter for 6 months, and rarely let a month pass without their visiting the shops to inquire prices. Petrovitch himself said that no better cloth could be had. For lining, they selected a cotton stuff, but so firm and thick that Petrovitch declared it to be better than silk, and even prettier and more glossy. They did not buy the marten fur, because it was, in fact, dear, but in its stead they picked out the very best of cat skin which could be found in the shop, and which might indeed be taken for marten at a distance. Petrovitch worked at the cloak 2 whole weeks, for there was a great deal of quilting. Otherwise it would have been finished sooner. He charged 12 rubles for the job. It could not possibly have been done for less. It was all sewed with silk, in small double seams, and Petrovitch went over each seam afterwards with his own teeth, stamping in various patterns. It is difficult to say precisely on what day, but probably the most glorious one in Akaky Akakiyevitch's life, when Petrovitch at length brought home the cloak. He brought it in the morning, before the hour when it was necessary to start for the department. Never did a cloak arrive so exactly in the nick of time, for the severe cold had set in, and it seemed to threaten to increase. Petrovitch brought the cloak himself, as befits a good tailor. On his countenance was a significant expression, such as Akaky Akakiyevitch had never beheld there. He seemed fully sensible that he had done no small deed, and crossed a gulf, separating tailors who put in linings and execute repairs from those who make new things. He took the cloak out of the pocket-handkerchief in which he had brought it. The handkerchief was fresh from the laundress, and he put it in his pocket for use. Taking out the cloak, he gazed proudly at it, held it up with both hands, and flung it skillfully over the shoulders of Akaky Akakiyevitch. Then he pulled it and fitted it down behind with his hand, and he draped it around Akaky Akakiyevitch without buttoning it. Akaky Akakiyevitch, like an experienced man, wished to try the sleeves. Petrovitch helped him on with them, and it turned out that the sleeves were satisfactory also. In short, the cloak appeared to be perfect, and most seasonable. Petrovich did not neglect to observe that it was only because he lived in a narrow street and had no signboard, and had known Akaky Akakievich so long that he had made it so cheaply. But that if he had been in business on the Nevsky Prospect, he would have charged 75 rubles for the making alone. Akaky Akakievich did not care to argue this point with Petrovich. He paid him, thanked him, and set out at once in his new cloak for the department. Petrovich followed him, and pausing in the street, gazed long at the cloak in the distance, after which he went to one side expressly to run through a crooked alley and emerge again into the street beyond, to gaze once more upon the cloak from another point, namely, directly in front. Meantime, Akaky Akakievich went on in holiday mood. He was conscious every second of the time that he had a new cloak on his shoulders, and several times he laughed with internal satisfaction. In fact, there were two advantages. One was its warmth, the other its beauty. He saw nothing of the road, but suddenly found himself at the department. He took off his cloak in the anteroom, looked it over carefully, and confided it to the special care of the attendant. It is impossible to say precisely how it was that everyone in the department knew at once that Akaky Akakievich had a new cloak and that the cape no longer existed. All rushed at the same moment into the anteroom to inspect it. They congratulated him and said pleasant things to him, so that he began at first to smile and then to grow ashamed. When all surrounded him and said that the new cloak must be christened and that he must at least give them all a party, Akaky Akakievich lost his head completely and did not know where he stood, what to answer, or how to get out of it. He stood blushing all over for several minutes, trying to assure them with great simplicity that it was not a new cloak, that it was, in fact, the old cape. At length, one of the officials, assistant to the head clerk, in order to show that he was not at all proud and on good terms with his inferiors, said, "So be it. Only I will give the party instead of Akaky Akakievich. I invite you all to tea with me tonight. It just happens to be my name day, too." The officials naturally at once offered the assistant clerk their congratulations and accepted the invitation with pleasure. Akaky Akakievich would have declined, but all declared that it was discourteous, that it was simply a sin and a shame, and that he could not possibly refuse. Besides, the notion became pleasant to him when he recollected that he should thereby have a chance of wearing his new cloak in the evening also. That whole day was truly a most triumphant festival for Akaky Akakievich. He returned home in the most happy frame of mind, took off his cloak, and hung it carefully on the wall, admiring afresh the cloth and the lining. Then he brought out his old, worn-out cloak for comparison. He looked at it and laughed, so vast was the difference. And long after dinner he laughed again when the condition of the cape recurred to his mind. He dined cheerfully, and after dinner wrote nothing, but took his ease for a while on the bed until it got dark. Then he dressed himself leisurely, put on his cloak, and stepped out into the street. Where the host lived, unfortunately, we cannot say. Our memory begins to fail us badly. The houses and streets in St. Petersburg have become so mixed up in our head that it is very difficult to get anything out of it again in proper form. This much is certain, that the official lived in the best part of the city, and therefore it must have been anything but near to Akaky Akakievich's residence. Akaky Akakievich was first obliged to traverse a kind of wilderness of deserted, dimly lighted streets. But in proportion as he approached the official's quarter of the city, the streets became more lively, more populous, and more brilliantly illuminated. Pedestrians began to appear. Handsomely dressed ladies were more frequently encountered. The men had otter-skin collars to their coats. Shabby sleighmen with their wooden railed sledges, stuck over with brass-headed nails, became rarer, whilst on the other hand, more and more drivers in red velvet caps, lacquered sledges and bearskin coats began to appear, and carriages with rich hammercloths flew swiftly through the streets, their wheels scrunching the snow. Akaky Akakievich gazed upon all this as upon a novel sight. He had not been in the streets during the evening for years. He halted out of curiosity before a shop window to look at a picture representing a handsome woman who had thrown off her shoe, thereby baring her whole foot in a very pretty way. Whilst behind her, the head of a man with whiskers and a handsome moustache peeped through the doorway of another room. Akaki Akakievich shook his head and laughed, and then went on his way. Why did he laugh? Either because he had met with a thing utterly unknown, but for which everyone cherishes, nevertheless, some sort of feeling, or else he thought, like many officials, "Well, those French, what is to be said? If they do go in for anything of that sort, why—" But possibly he did not think at all. Akaki Akakievich at length reached the house in which the head clerk's assistant lodged. He lived in fine style. The staircase was lit by a lamp, his apartment being on the second floor. On entering the vestibule, Akaki Akakievich beheld a whole row of galoshes on the floor. Among them, in the center of the room, stood a samovar, humming and emitting clouds of steam. On the walls hung all sorts of coats and cloaks, among which there were even some with beaver collars or velvet facings. Beyond, the buzz of conversation was audible and became clear and loud when the servant came out with a trayful of empty glasses, cream jugs, and sugar bowls. It was evident that the officials had arrived long before and had already finished their first glass of tea. Akaki Akakievich, having hung up his own cloak, entered the inner room. Before him, all at once appeared lights, officials, pipes, and card tables, and he was bewildered by a sound of rapid conversation rising from all the tables and the noise of moving chairs. He halted very awkwardly in the middle of the room, wondering what he ought to do. But they had seen him. They received him with a shout, and all thronged at once into the ante-room, and there took another look at his cloak. Akaki Akakievich, although somewhat confused, was frank-hearted, and could not refrain from rejoicing when he saw how they praised his cloak. Then, of course, they all dropped him and his cloak, and returned, as was proper, to the tables set out for whist. All this, the noise, the talk, and the throng of people, was rather overwhelming to Akaki Akakievich. He simply did not know where he stood, or where to put his hands, his feet, and his whole body. Finally, he sat down by the players, looked at the cards, gazed at the face of one and another, and after a while began to gape, and to feel that it was wearisome, the more so, as the hour was already long past when he usually went to bed. He wanted to take leave of the host, but they would not let him go, saying that he must not fail to drink a glass of champagne in honor of his new garment. In the course of an hour, supper, consisting of vegetable salad, cold veal, pastry, confectioner's pies, and champagne, was served. They made Akaki Akakievich drink 2 glasses of champagne, after which he felt things grow livelier. Still, he could not forget that it was 12 o'clock and that he should have been at home long ago. In order that the host might not think of some excuse for detaining him, he stole out of the room quickly, sought out, in the ante-room, his cloak, which, to his sorrow, he found lying on the floor, brushed it, picked off every speck upon it, put it on his shoulders, and descended the stairs to the street. In the street, all was still bright. Some petty shops, those permanent clubs of servants and all sorts of folks, were open. Others were shut, but nevertheless showed a streak of light the whole length of the door crack, indicating that they were not yet free of company, and that probably some domestics, male and female, were finishing their stories and conversations whilst leaving their masters in complete ignorance as to their whereabouts. Akaki Akakievich went on in a happy frame of mind. He even started to run, without knowing why, after some lady who flew past like a flash of lightning. But he stopped short and went on very quietly as before, wondering why he had quickened his pace. Soon there spread before him these deserted streets, which are not cheerful in the daytime, to say nothing of the evening. Now they were even more dim and lonely. The lanterns began to grow rarer. Oil, evidently, had been less liberally supplied. Then came wooden houses and fences. Not a soul anywhere. Only the snow sparkled in the streets and mournfully veiled the low-roofed cabins with their closed shutters. He approached the spot where the street crossed a vast square with houses barely visible on its farther side, a square which seemed a fearful desert. Afar, a tiny spark glimmered from some watchman's box, which seemed to stand on the edge of the world. Akaky Akakievich's cheerfulness diminished at this point in a marked degree. He entered the square, not without an involuntary sensation of fear, as though his heart warned him of some evil. He glanced back, and on both sides it was like a sea about him. No, it is better not to look, he thought, and went on, closing his eyes. When he opened them, to see whether he was near the end of the square, he suddenly beheld, standing just before his very nose, some bearded individuals of precisely what sort he could not make out. All grew dark before his eyes, and his heart throbbed. "Of course, the cloak is mine," said one of them in a loud voice, seizing hold of his collar. Akaky Akakievich was about to shout, "Help!" when the second man thrust a fist, about the size of an official's head, at his very mouth, muttering, "Just you dare to scream!" Akaky Akakievich felt them strip off his cloak and give him a kick. He fell headlong upon the snow and felt no more. In a few minutes he recovered consciousness and rose to his feet, but no one was there. He felt that it was cold in the square and that his cloak was gone. He began to shout, but his voice did not appear to reach the outskirts of the square. In despair, but without ceasing to shout, he started at a run across the square, straight towards the watchbox, beside which stood the watchman, leaning on his halberd, and apparently curious to know what kind of a customer was running towards him, shouting. Akaky Akakievich ran up to him and began in a sobbing voice to shout that he was asleep and attended to nothing, and did not see when a man was robbed. The watchman replied that he had seen two men stop him in the middle of the square, but supposed that they were friends of his, and that, instead of scolding vainly, he had better go to the police on the morrow so that they might make a search for whoever had stolen the cloak. Akaky Akakievich ran home and arrived in a state of complete disorder, his hair, which grew very thinly upon his temples, and the back of his head all tousled, his body, arms and legs, covered with snow. The old woman, who was mistress of his lodgings, on hearing a terrible knocking, sprang hastily from her bed, and with only one shoe on, ran to open the door, pressing the sleeve of her chemise to her bosom out of modesty. But when she had opened it, she fell back on beholding Akaky Akakievich in such a condition. When he told her about the affair, she clasped her hands and said that he must go straight to the district chief of police, for his subordinate would turn up his nose, promise well, and drop the matter there. The very best thing to do, therefore, would be to go to the district chief, whom she knew, because Finnish Anna, her former cook, was now nurse at his house. She often saw him passing the house, and he was at church every Sunday, praying, but at the same time gazing cheerfully at everybody, so that he must be a good man, judging from all appearances. Having listened to this opinion, Akaky Akakievich betook himself sadly to his room. And how he spent the night there, anyone who can put himself in another's place may readily imagine. Early in the morning, he presented himself at the district chief's, but was told the official was asleep. He went again at 10 and was again informed that he was asleep. At 11, and they said, "The superintendent is not at home." At dinner time, and the clerks in the anteroom would not admit him on any terms, and insisted upon knowing his business. So that at last, for once in his life, Akaky Akakievich felt an inclination to show some spirit, and said curtly that he must see the chief in person, that they ought not to presume to refuse him entrance, that he came from the Department of Justice, and that when he complained of them, they would see. The clerks dared make no reply to this, and one of them went to call the chief, who listened to the strange story of the theft of the coat. Instead of directing his attention to the principal points of the matter, he began to question Akaky Akakievich. Why was he going home so late? Was he in the habit of doing so, or had he been to some disorderly house? so that Akaki Akakievich got thoroughly confused and left him without knowing whether the affair of his cloak was in proper train or not. All that day, for the first time in his life, he never went near the department. The next day he made his appearance, very pale, and in his old cape, which had become even more shabby. The news of the robbery of the cloak touched many, although there were some officials present who never lost an opportunity, even such a one as the present, of ridiculing Akaki Akakievich. They decided to make a collection for him on the spot, but the officials had already spent a great deal in subscribing for the director's portrait and for some book at the suggestion of the head of that division, who was a friend of the author, and so the sum was trifling. One of them, moved by pity, resolved to help Akaki Akakievich with some good advice at least, and told him that he ought not to go to the police, for although it might happen that a police officer, wishing to win the approval of his superiors, might hunt up the cloak by some means, still his cloak would remain in the possession of the police if he did not offer legal proof that it belonged to him. The best thing for him, therefore, would be to apply to a certain prominent personage, since this prominent personage, by entering into relation with the proper persons, could greatly expedite the matter. As there was nothing else to be done, Akaki Akakievich decided to go to the prominent personage. What was the exact official position of the prominent personage remains unknown to this day. The reader must know that the prominent personage had but recently become a prominent personage, having up to that time been only an insignificant person. Moreover, his present position was not considered prominent in comparison with others still more so. But there is always a circle of people to whom what is insignificant in the eyes of others is important enough. Moreover, he strove to increase his importance by sundry devices. For instance, he managed to have the inferior officials meet him on the staircase when he entered upon his service. No one was to presume to come directly to him, but the strictest etiquette must be observed. The collegiate recorder must make a report to the government secretary to the titular councillor, or whatever other man was proper, and all business must come before him in this manner. In Holy Russia, all is thus contaminated with the love of imitation. Every man imitates and copies his superior. They even say that a certain titular councillor, when promoted to the head of some small separate office, immediately partitioned off a private room for himself, called it the audience chamber, and posted at the door a lackey with red collar and braid, who grasped the handle of the door and opened to all comers, though the audience chamber would hardly hold an ordinary writing table. The manners and customs of the prominent personage were grand and imposing, but rather exaggerated. The main foundation of his system was strictness. Strictness, strictness, and always strictness, he generally said, and at the last word he looked significantly into the face of the person to whom he spoke. But there was no necessity for this, for the half-score of subordinates who formed the entire force of the office were properly afraid. On catching sight of him afar off, they left their work and waited, drawn up in line, until he had passed through the room. His ordinary converse with his inferiors smacked of sternness and consisted chiefly of 3 phrases. How dare you? Do you know whom you're speaking to? Do you realize who is standing before you? Otherwise, he was a very kind-hearted man, good to his comrades, and ready to oblige. But the rank of general threw him completely off his balance. On receiving any one of that rank, he became confused, lost his way, as it were, and never knew what to do. If he chanced to be amongst his equals, he was still a very nice kind of man, a very good fellow in many respects, and not stupid, but the very moment that he found himself in the society of people but one rank lower than himself, he became silent. And his situation aroused sympathy, the more so, as he felt himself that he might have been making an incomparably better use of his time. In his eyes, there was sometimes visible a desire to join some interesting conversation or group, but he was kept back by the thought, would it not be a very great condescension on his part? Would it not be familiar? And would he not thereby lose his importance? And in consequence of such reflections, he always remained in the same dumb state, uttering from time to time a few monosyllabic sounds, and thereby earning the name of the most wearisome of men. To this prominent personage, Akaki Akakievich presented himself, and this at the most unfavorable time for himself, though opportune for the prominent personage. The prominent personage was in his cabinet, conversing very gaily with an old acquaintance and companion of his childhood, whom he had not seen for several years, and who had just arrived when it was announced to him that a person named Bashmachkin had come. He asked abruptly, "Who is he?" "Some official," he was informed. "Ah, he can wait. This is no time for him to call," said the important man. It must be remarked here that the important man lied outrageously. He had said all he had to say to his friend long before, and the conversation had been interspersed for some time with very long pauses, during which they merely slapped each other on the leg and said, "You think so, Ivan Abramovich." "Just so, Stepan Valamovich." Nevertheless, he ordered that the official should be kept waiting, in order to show his friend, a man who had not been in the service for a long time, but had lived at home in the country, how long officials had to wait in his anteroom. At length, having talked himself completely out, and more than that, having had his fill of pauses and smoked a cigar in a very comfortable armchair with reclining back, he suddenly seemed to recollect and said to the secretary, who stood by the door with papers of reports, "So it seems that there is an official waiting to see me. Tell him that he may come in." On perceiving Akaki Akakievich's modest mien and his worn uniform, he turned abruptly to him and said, "What do you want?" in a curt, hard voice, which he had practiced in his room in private and before the looking-glass for a whole week before being raised to his present rank. Akaki Akakievich, who was already imbued with a due amount of fear, became somewhat confused, and as well as his tongue would permit, explained, with a rather more frequent addition than usual of the word that his cloak was quite new and had been stolen in the most inhuman manner, that he had applied to him in order that he might, in some way, by his intermediation, that he might enter into correspondence with the chief of police and find the cloak. For some inexplicable reason, this conduct seemed familiar to the prominent personage. "What, my dear sir," he said abruptly, "are you not acquainted with etiquette? To whom have you come? Don't you know how such matters are managed? You should first have presented a petition to the office. It would have gone to the head of the department, then to the chief of the division, then it would have been handed over to the secretary, and the secretary would have given it to me." "But, Your Excellency," said Akaki Akakievich, trying to collect his small handful of wits, and conscious at the same time that he was perspiring terribly, "I, Your Excellency, presume to trouble you because secretaries are an untrustworthy race." What? Said the important personage. "Where did you get such courage? Where did you get such ideas? What impudence towards their chiefs and superiors has spread among the young generation?" The prominent personage apparently had not observed that Akaki Akakievich was already in the neighborhood of 50. If he could be called a young man, it must have been in comparison with someone who was 70. "Do you know to whom you're speaking? Do you realize who is standing before you? Do you realize it? Do you realize it? I ask you." Then he stamped his foot and raised his voice to such a pitch that it would have frightened even a different man from Akaki Akakievich. Akaki Akakievich's senses failed him. He staggered, trembled in every limb, and if the porters had not run in to support him, would have fallen to the floor. They carried him out insensible, but the prominent personage, gratified that the effect should have surpassed his expectations, and quite intoxicated with the thought that his word could even deprive a man of his senses, glanced sideways at his friend in order to see how he looked upon this, and perceived, not without satisfaction, that his friend was in a most uneasy frame of mind, and even beginning on his part to feel a trifle frightened. Akaki Akakievich could not remember how he descended the stairs and got into the street. He felt neither his hands nor feet. Never in his life had he been so rated by any high official, let alone a strange one. He went staggering on through the snowstorm, which was blowing in the streets, with his mouth wide open. The wind, in St. Petersburg fashion, darted upon him from all quarters and down every cross street. In a twinkling, it had blown a quinsy into his throat, and he reached home unable to utter a word. His throat was swollen, and he lay down on his bed. So powerful is sometimes a good scolding. The next day, a violent fever developed. Thanks to the generous assistance of the St. Petersburg climate, the malady progressed more rapidly than could have been expected, and when the doctor arrived, he found, on feeling the sick man's pulse, that there was nothing to be done except to prescribe a poultice so that the patient might not be left entirely without the beneficent aid of medicine. But at the same time, he predicted his end in 36 hours. After this, he turned to the landlady and said, "And as for you, don't waste your time on him. Order his pine coffin now. For an oak, one will be too expensive for him." Did Akaky Akakievich hear these fatal words? And if he heard them, did they produce any overwhelming effect upon him? Did he lament the bitterness of his life? We know not, for he continued in a delirious condition. Visions incessantly appeared to him, each stranger than the other. Now he saw Petrovich and ordered him to make a cloak with some traps for robbers who seemed to him to be always under the bed, and he cried every moment to the landlady to pull one of them from under his coverlet. Then he inquired why his old mantle hung before him when he had a new cloak. Next he fancied that he was standing before the prominent person, listening to a thorough setting down and saying, "Forgive me, your excellency." But at last he began to curse, uttering the most horrible words, so that his aged landlady crossed herself, never in her life having heard anything of the kind from him, and more so as these words followed directly after the words, "Your Excellency." Later on he talked utter nonsense, of which nothing could be made, all that was evident being that these incoherent words and thoughts hovered ever about one thing, his cloak. At length, poor Akaky Akakievich breathed his last. They sealed up neither his room nor his effects, because in the first place there were no heirs, and in the second there was very little to inherit beyond a bundle of goose quills, a quire of white official paper, 3 pairs of socks, 2 or 3 buttons which had burst off his trousers, and the mantle already known to the reader. To whom all this fell, God knows. I confess that the person who told me this tale took no interest in the matter. They carried Akaky Akakievich out and buried him, and St. Petersburg was left without Akaky Akakievich, as though he had never lived there. A being disappeared, who was protected by none, dear to none, interesting to none, and who never even attracted to himself the attention of those students of human nature who omit no opportunity of thrusting a pin through a common fly and examining it under the microscope. A being who bore meekly the gibes of the department, and went to his grave without having done one unusual deed, but to whom, nevertheless, at the close of his life, appeared a bright visitant in the form of a cloak, which momentarily cheered his poor life, and upon him, thereafter, an intolerable misfortune descended, just as it descends upon the heads of the mighty of this world. Several days after his death, the porter was sent from the department to his lodgings, with an order for him to present himself there immediately, the chief commanding it. But the porter had to return unsuccessful, with the answer that he could not come. And to the question, "Why?" replied, "Well, because he is dead. He was buried 4 days ago." In this manner did they hear of Akaky Akakievich's death at the department. And the next day a new official sat in his place, with a handwriting by no means so upright, but more inclined and slanting. But who could have imagined that this was not really the end of Akaky Akakievich, that he was destined to raise a commotion after death, as if in compensation for his utterly insignificant life? But so it happened, and our poor story unexpectedly gains a fantastic ending. A rumor suddenly spread through St. Petersburg that a dead man had taken to appearing on the Kalinkin Bridge and its vicinity at night in the form of an official seeking a stolen cloak, and that, under the pretext of its being the stolen cloak, he dragged, without regard to rank or calling, everyone's cloak from his shoulders, be it catskin, beaver, fox, bear, sable, in a word, every sort of fur and skin which men adopted for their covering. One of the department officials saw the dead man with his own eyes and immediately recognized in him Akaki Akakievich. This, however, inspired him with such terror that he ran off with all his might, and therefore did not scan the dead man closely, but only saw how the latter threatened him from afar with his finger. Constant complaints poured in from all quarters that the backs and shoulders, not only of titular but even of court councillors, were exposed to the danger of a cold on account of the frequent dragging off of their cloaks. Arrangements were made by the police to catch the corpse, alive or dead at any cost, and punish him as an example to others in the most severe manner. In this they nearly succeeded, for a watchman, on guard in Kirinshkin Lane, caught the corpse by the collar on the very scene of his evil deeds when attempting to pull off the frieze cloak of a retired musician. Having seized him by the collar, he summoned, with a shout, two of his comrades, whom he enjoined to hold him fast, while he himself felt for a moment in his boot in order to draw out his snuff-box and refresh his frozen nose. But the snuff was of a sort which even a corpse could not endure. The watchman, having closed his right nostril with his finger, had no sooner succeeded in holding half a handful up to the left than the corpse sneezed so violently that he completely filled the eyes of all three. While they raised their hands to wipe them, the dead man vanished completely, so that they positively did not know whether they had actually had him in their grip at all. Thereafter, the watchmen conceived such a terror of dead men that they were afraid even to seize the living, and only screamed from a distance, "Hey there! Go your way!" So the dead official began to appear even beyond the Kalinkin Bridge, causing no little terror to all timid people. But we have totally neglected that certain prominent personage who may really be considered as the cause of the fantastic turn taken by this true history. First of all, justice compels us to say that after the departure of poor, annihilated Akaki Akakievich, he felt something like remorse. Suffering was unpleasant to him, for his heart was accessible to many good impulses, in spite of the fact that his rank often prevented his showing his true self. As soon as his friend had left his cabinet, he began to think about poor Akaki Akakievich, and from that day forth, poor Akaki Akakievich, who could not bear up under an official reprimand, recurred to his mind almost every day. The thought troubled him to such an extent that a week later he even resolved to send an official to him, to learn whether he really could assist him. And when it was reported to him that Akaki Akakievich had died suddenly of fever, he was startled, hearkened to the reproaches of his conscience, and was out of sorts for the whole day. Wishing to divert his mind in some way and drive away the disagreeable impression, he set out that evening for one of his friends' houses, where he found quite a large party assembled. What was better, nearly everyone was of the same rank as himself, so that he need not feel in the least constrained. This had a marvelous effect upon his mental state. He grew expansive, made himself agreeable in conversation. In short, he passed a delightful evening. After supper, he drank a couple of glasses of champagne, not a bad recipe for cheerfulness, as everyone knows. The champagne inclined him to various adventures, and he determined not to return home, but to go and see a certain well-known lady of German extraction, Karolina Ivanovna, a lady, it appears, with whom he was on a very friendly footing. It must be mentioned that the prominent personage was no longer a young man, but a good husband and respected father of a family. Two sons, one of whom was already in the service, and a good-looking 16-year-old daughter with a slightly arched but pretty little nose, came every morning to kiss his hand and say, "Bonjour, Papa." His wife, a still fresh and good-looking woman, first gave him her hand to kiss, and then, reversing the procedure, kissed his. But the prominent personage, though perfectly satisfied in his domestic relations, considered it stylish to have a friend in another quarter of the city. This friend was scarcely prettier or younger than his wife, but there are such puzzles in the world, and it is not our place to judge them. So the important personage descended the stairs, stepped into his sledge, said to the coachman, "To Karolina Ivanovna's," and wrapping himself luxuriously in his warm cloak, found himself in that delightful frame of mind than which a Russian can conceive nothing better, namely, when you think of nothing yourself, yet when the thoughts creep into your mind of their own accord, each more agreeable than the other, giving you no trouble either to drive them away or seek them. Fully satisfied, he recalled all the gay features of the evening just past and all the mots which had made the little circle laugh. Many of them he repeated in a low voice and found them quite as funny as before, so it is not surprising that he should laugh heartily at them. Occasionally, however, he was interrupted by gusts of wind, which, coming suddenly, God knows whence or why, cut his face, drove masses of snow into it, filled out his cloak collar like a sail, or suddenly blew it over his head with supernatural force, and thus caused him constant trouble to disentangle himself. Suddenly, the important personage felt someone clutch him firmly by the collar. Turning round, he perceived a man of short stature, in an old, worn uniform, and recognized, not without terror, Akaky Akakievich. The official's face was white as snow, and looked just like a corpse's. But the horror of the important personage transcended all bounds when he saw the dead man's mouth open, and heard it utter the following remarks, while it breathed upon him the terrible odour of the grave. "Ah, here you are at last. I have you, that, by the collar. I need your cloak. You took no trouble about mine, but reprimanded me. So now, give up your own." The pallid, prominent personage almost died of fright. Brave as he was in the office and in the presence of inferiors generally, and although, at the sight of his manly form and appearance, everyone said, "Ah, how much character he has." At this crisis, he, like many possessed of an heroic exterior, experienced such terror that not without cause he began to fear an attack of illness. He flung his cloak hastily from his shoulders and shouted to his coachman in an unnatural voice, "Home at full speed!" The coachman, hearing the tone which is generally employed at critical moments, and even accompanied by something much more tangible, drew his head down between his shoulders in case of an emergency, flourished his whip, and flew on like an arrow. In a little more than 6 minutes, the prominent personage was at the entrance of his own house. Pale, thoroughly scared, and cloakless, he went home instead of to Karolina Ivanovna's, reached his room somehow or other, and passed the night in the direst distress, so that the next morning over their tea his daughter had said, "You are very pale today, Papa." But Papa remained silent, and said not a word to anyone of what had happened to him, where he had been, or where he had intended to go. This occurrence made a deep impression upon him. He even began to say, "How dare you? Do you realize who is standing before you?" Less frequently to the under-officials, and if he did utter the words, it was only after first having learned the bearings of the matter. But the most noteworthy point was that from that day forward the apparition of the dead official ceased to be seen. Evidently the prominent personage's cloak just fitted his shoulders. At all events, no more instances of his dragging cloaks from people's shoulders were heard of. But many active and solicitous persons could by no means reassure themselves, and asserted that the dead official still showed himself in distant parts of the city. In fact, one watchman in Koloman saw with his own eyes the apparition come from behind a house. But the watchman was not a strong man, so he was afraid to arrest him, and followed him in the dark, until, at length, the apparition looked round, paused, and inquired, "What do you want?" at the same time showing such a fist as is never seen on living men. The watchman said, "Nothing," and turned back instantly. But the apparition was much too tall, wore huge moustaches, and directing its steps apparently towards the Obukhov bridge, disappeared in the darkness of the night.
The V by Nikolai Gogol. The V is a monstrous creation of popular fancy. It is the name which the inhabitants of Little Russia give to the king of the gnomes, whose eyelashes reach to the ground. The following story is a specimen of such folklore. I have made no alterations, but reproduce it in the same simple form in which I heard it. Author's note. 1. As soon as the clear seminary bell began sounding in Kiev in the morning, the pupils would come flocking from all parts of the town. The students of grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology hastened with their books under their arms over the streets. The grammarians were still mere boys. On the way, they pushed against each other and quarreled with shrill voices. Nearly all of them wore torn or dirty clothes, and their pockets were always crammed with all kinds of things: pushbones, pipes made out of pens, remains of confectionery, and sometimes even young sparrows. The latter would sometimes begin to chirp in the midst of deep silence in the school and bring down on their possessors severe canings and thrashings. The rhetoricians walked in a more orderly way. Their clothes were generally untorn, but on the other hand, their faces were often strangely decorated. One had a black eye, and the lips of another resembled a single blister, etc. These spoke to each other in tenor voices. The philosophers talked in a tone an octave lower. In their pockets, they only had fragments of tobacco, never whole cakes of it. For what they could get hold of, they used at once. They smelt so strongly of tobacco and brandy that a workman passing by them would often remain standing and sniffing with his nose in the air like a hound. About this time of day, the marketplace was generally full of bustle, and the market women, selling rolls, cakes, and honey tarts, plucked the sleeves of those who wore coats of fine cloth or cotton. Young sir! Young sir! Here! Here!" they cried from all sides. "Rolls and cakes and tasty tarts, very delicious. I have baked them myself." Another drew something long and crooked out of her basket and cried, "Here is a sausage, young sir. Buy a sausage." "Don't buy anything from her," cried a rival. "See how greasy she is, and what a dirty nose and hands she has." But the market women carefully avoided appealing to the philosophers and theologians, for these only took handfuls of eatables merely to taste them. Arrived at the seminary, the whole crowd of students dispersed into the low, large classrooms with small windows, broad doors, and blackened benches. Suddenly, they were filled with a many-toned murmur. The teachers heard the pupils' lessons repeated, some in shrill and others in deep voices which sounded like a distant booming. While the lessons were being said, the teachers kept a sharp eye open to see whether pieces of cake or other dainties were protruding from their pupils' pockets. If so, they were promptly confiscated. When this learned crowd arrived somewhat earlier than usual, or when it was known that the teachers would come somewhat late, a battle would ensue, as though planned by general agreement. In this battle, all had to take part, even the monitors who were appointed to look after the order and morality of the whole school. Two theologians generally arranged the conditions of the battle, whether each class should split into two sides, or whether all the pupils should divide themselves into two halves. In each case, the grammarians began the battle, and after the rhetoricians had joined in, the former retired and stood on the benches in order to watch the fortunes of the fray. Then came the philosophers with long black mustaches, and finally the thick-necked theologians. The battle generally ended in a victory for the latter, and the philosophers retired to the different classrooms, rubbing their aching limbs and throwing themselves on the benches to take breath. When the teacher, who in his own time had taken part in such contests, entered the classroom, he saw by the heated faces of his pupils that the battle had been very severe, and while he caned the hands of the rhetoricians, in another room another teacher did the same for the philosophers. On Sundays and festival days, the seminarists took puppet theatres to the citizens' houses. Sometimes they acted a comedy, and in that case, it was always a theologian who took the part of the hero or heroine, Potiphar or Herodias, etc. As a reward for their exertions, they received a piece of linen, a sack of maize, half a roast goose, or something similar. All the students, lay and clerical, were very poorly provided with means for procuring themselves necessary subsistence, but at the same time very fond of eating, so that however much food was given to them, they were never satisfied, and the gifts bestowed by rich landowners were never adequate for their needs. Therefore, the commissariat committee, consisting of philosophers and theologians, sometimes dispatched the grammarians and rhetoricians under the leadership of a philosopher, themselves sometimes joining in the expedition, with sacks on their shoulders, into the town, in order to levy a contribution on the flesh-pots of the citizens. And then there was a feast in the seminary. The most important event in the seminary year was the arrival of the holidays. These began in July, and then generally all the students went home. At that time, all the roads were thronged with grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians. He who had no home of his own would take up his quarters with some fellow student's family. The philosophers and theologians looked out for tutors' posts, taught the children of rich farmers, and received for doing so a pair of new boots and sometimes also a new coat. A whole troop of them would go off in close ranks like a regiment. They cooked their porridge in common and encamped under the open sky. Each had a bag with him containing a shirt and a pair of socks. The theologians were especially economical. In order not to wear out their boots too quickly, they took them off and carried them on a stick over their shoulders, especially when the road was very muddy. Then they tucked up their breeches over their knees and waded bravely through the pools and puddles. Whenever they spied a village near the highway, they at once left it, approached the house, which seemed the most considerable, and began with loud voices to sing a psalm. The master of the house, an old Cossack engaged in agriculture, would listen for a long time with his head propped in his hands, then with tears on his cheeks say to his wife, "What the students are singing sounds very devout. Bring out some lard and anything else of the kind we have in the house." After thus replenishing their stores, the students would continue their way. The farther they went, the smaller grew their numbers as they dispersed to their various houses and left those whose homes were still farther on. On one occasion, during such a march, 3 students left the main road in order to get provisions in some village, since their stock had long been exhausted. This party consisted of the theologian Calava, the philosopher Thomas Brutus, and the rhetorician Tiberius Gorobetz. The first was a tall youth with broad shoulders and of a peculiar character. Everything which came within reach of his fingers he felt obliged to appropriate. Moreover, he was of a very melancholy disposition, and when he had got intoxicated, he hid himself in the most tangled thickets, so that the seminary officials had the greatest trouble in finding him. The philosopher Thomas Brutus was a more cheerful character. He liked to lie for a long time on the same spot and smoke his pipe, and when he was merry with wine, he hired a fiddler and danced the tropak. Often he got a whole quantity of beans, that is, thrashings, but these he endured with complete philosophic calm, saying that a man cannot escape his destiny. The rhetorician Tiberius Gorobetz had not yet the right to wear a moustache, to drink brandy, or to smoke tobacco. He only wore a small crop of hair, as though his character was at present too little developed. To judge by the great bumps on his forehead with which he often appeared in the classroom, it might be expected that some day he would be a valiant fighter. Calava and Thomas often pulled his hair as a mark of their special favor and sent him on their errands. Evening had already come when they left the high road. The sun had just gone down, and the air was still heavy with the heat of the day. The theologian and the philosopher strolled along, smoking in silence, while the rhetorician struck off the heads of the thistles by the wayside with his stick. The way wound on, through thick woods of oak and walnut. Green hills alternated here and there with meadows. Twice already they had seen cornfields, from which they concluded that they were near some village, but an hour had already passed, and no human habitation appeared. The sky was already quite dark, and only a red gleam lingered on the western horizon. "The deuce!" said the philosopher Thomas Brutus. "I was almost certain we would soon reach a village." The theologian still remained silent, looked round him, then put his pipe again between his teeth, and all three continued their way. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the philosopher, and stood still. "Now the road itself is disappearing." "Perhaps we shall find a farm farther on," answered the theologian, without taking his pipe out of his mouth. Meanwhile, the night had descended. Clouds increased the darkness, and according to all appearance, there was no chance of moon or stars appearing. The seminarists found that they had lost the way altogether. After the philosopher had vainly sought for a footpath, he exclaimed, "Where have we got to?" The theologian thought for a while and said, "Yes, it is really dark." The rhetorician went on one side, lay on the ground, and groped for a path. But his hands encountered only foxholes. All around lay a huge step, over which no one seemed to have passed. The wanderers made several efforts to get forward, but the landscape grew wilder and more inhospitable. The philosopher tried to shout, but his voice was lost in vacancy. No one answered. Only some moments later they heard a faint groaning sound, like the whimpering of a wolf. "Curse it all! What shall we do?" said the philosopher. "Why, just stop here and spend the night in the open air," answered the theologian. So saying, he felt in his pocket, brought out his timber and steel, and lit his pipe. But the philosopher could not agree with this proposal. He was not accustomed to sleep till he had first eaten 5 pounds of bread and 5 of dripping, and so he now felt an intolerable emptiness in his stomach. Besides, in spite of his cheerful temperament, he was a little afraid of the wolves. "No, Calaver," he said, "that won't do. To lie down like a dog and without any supper. Let us try once more. Perhaps we shall find a house and the consolation of having a glass of brandy to drink before going to sleep." At the word brandy, the theologian spat on one side and said, "Yes, of course, we cannot remain all night in the open air." The students went on, and to their great joy they heard the barking of dogs in the distance. After listening a while to see from which direction the barking came, they went on their way with new courage and soon espied a light. "A village, by heavens, a village!" exclaimed the philosopher. His supposition proved correct. They soon saw 2 or 3 houses built round a courtyard. Lights glimmered in the windows, and before the fence stood a number of trees. The students looked through the crevices of the gates and saw a courtyard in which stood a large number of roving tradesmen's carts. In the sky there were now fewer clouds, and here and there a star was visible. "See, brother," one of them said, "we must now cry halt. Cost what it may, we must find entrance and a night's lodging." The 3 students knocked together at the gate and cried, "Open!" The door of one of the houses creaked on its hinges, and an old woman wrapped in a sheepskin appeared. "Who is there?" she exclaimed, coughing loudly. "Let us spend the night here, mother. We have lost our way, our stomachs are empty, and we do not want to spend the night out of doors." "But what sort of people are you?" "Quite harmless people. The theologian Calaver, the philosopher Brutus, and the rhetorician Gorobetz." "It is impossible," answered the old woman. "The whole house is full of people, and every corner occupied. Where can I put you up? You are big and heavy enough to break the house down. I know these philosophers and theologians. When once one takes them in, They eat one out of house and home. Go farther on. There is no room here for you. Have pity on us, mother. How can you be so heartless? Don't let Christians perish. Put us up where you like, and if we eat up your provisions or do any other damage, may our hands wither up, and all the punishment of heaven light on us. The old woman seemed a little touched. Well, she said, after a few moments' consideration, I will let you in, but I must put you in different rooms, for I should have no quiet if you were all together at night. Do just as you like. We won't say any more about it, answered the students. The gates moved heavily on their hinges, and they entered the courtyard. Well now, mother, said the philosopher, following the old woman, if you had a little scrap of something, by heavens, my stomach is as empty as a drum. I have not had a bit of bread in my mouth since early this morning. Didn't I say so? Replied the old woman. There you go begging at once, but I have no food in the house, nor any fire. But we will pay for everything, continued the philosopher. We will pay early tomorrow in cash. Go on and be content with what you get. You are fine fellows whom the devil has brought here. Her reply greatly depressed the philosopher Thomas, but suddenly his nose caught the odor of dried fish. He looked at the breeches of the theologian, who walked by his side, and saw a huge fish's tail sticking out of his pocket. The latter had already seized the opportunity to steal a whole fish from one of the carts standing in the courtyard. He had not done this from hunger so much as from the force of habit. He had quite forgotten the fish, and was looking about to see whether he could not find something else to appropriate. Then the philosopher put his hand in the theologian's pocket, as though it were his own, and laid hold of his prize. The old woman found a special resting place for each student. The rhetorician she put in a shed, the theologian in an empty storeroom, and the philosopher in a sheep's stall. As soon as the philosopher was alone, he devoured the fish in a twinkling, examined the fence which enclosed the stall, kicked away a pig from a neighboring stall, which had inquiringly inserted its nose through a crevice, and lay down on his right side to sleep like a corpse. Then the low door opened, and the old woman came crouching into the stall. "Well, mother, what do you want here?" asked the philosopher. She made no answer, but came with outstretched arms towards him. The philosopher shrank back, but she still approached, as though she wished to lay hold of him. A terrible fright seized him, for he saw the old hag's eyes sparkle in an extraordinary way. "Away with you, old witch! Away with you!" he shouted. But she still stretched her hands after him. He jumped up in order to rush out, but she placed herself before the door, fixed her glowing eyes upon him, and again approached him. The philosopher tried to push her away with his hands, but to his astonishment he found that he could neither lift his hands, nor move his legs, nor utter an audible word. He only heard his heart beating, and saw the old woman approach him, place his hands crosswise on his breast, and bend his head down. Then, with the agility of a cat, she sprang on his shoulders, struck him on the side with a broom, and he began to run like a racehorse, carrying her on his shoulders. All this happened with such swiftness that the philosopher could scarcely collect his thoughts. He laid hold of his knees with both hands in order to stop his legs from running, but to his great astonishment they kept moving forward against his will, making rapid springs like a Caucasian horse. Not till the house had been left behind them, and a wide plain stretched before them, bordered on one side by a black, gloomy wood, did he say to himself, "Ah, it is a witch." The half-moon shone pale and high in the sky. Its mild light, still more subdued by intervening clouds, fell like a transparent veil on the earth. Woods, meadows, hills, and valleys all seemed to be sleeping with open eyes. Nowhere was a breath of air stirring. The atmosphere was moist and warm. The shadows of the trees and bushes fell sharply defined on the sloping plain. Such was the night through which the philosopher Thomas Brutus sped with his strange rider. A strange, oppressive, and yet sweet sensation took possession of his heart. He looked down and saw how the grass beneath his feet seemed to be quite deep and far away. Over it there flowed a flood of crystal-clear water, and the grassy plain looked like the bottom of a transparent sea. He saw his own image, and that of the old woman whom he carried on his back, clearly reflected in it. Then he beheld how, instead of the moon, a strange sun shone there. He heard the deep tones of bells and saw them swinging. He saw a water nixie rise from a bed of tall reeds. She turned to him, and her face was clearly visible, and she sang a song which penetrated his soul. Then she approached him and nearly reached the surface of the water, on which she burst into laughter and again disappeared. Did he see it, or did he not see it? Was he dreaming, or was he awake? But what was that below? Wind or music? It sounded and drew nearer, and penetrated his soul like a song that rose and fell. "What is it?" he thought, as he gazed into the depths and still sped rapidly along. The perspiration flowed from him in streams. He experienced simultaneously a strange feeling of oppression and delight in all his being. Often he felt as though he had no longer a heart, and pressed his hand on his breast with alarm. Weary to death, he began to repeat all the prayers which he knew, and all the formulas of exorcism against evil spirits. Suddenly he experienced a certain relief. He felt that his pace was slackening. The witch weighed less heavily on his shoulders, and the thick herbage of the plain was again beneath his feet, with nothing especial to remark about it. "Splendid," thought the philosopher Thomas, and began to repeat his exorcisms in a still louder voice. Then suddenly he wrenched himself away from under the witch and sprang on her back in his turn. She began to run, with short, trembling steps indeed, but so rapidly that he could hardly breathe. So swiftly did she run that she hardly seemed to touch the ground. They were still on the plain, but owing to the rapidity of their flight, everything seemed indistinct and confused before his eyes. He seized a stick that was lying on the ground and began to belabor the hag with all his might. She uttered a wild cry, which at first sounded raging and threatening. Then it became gradually weaker and more gentle, till at last it sounded quite low, like the pleasant tones of a silver bell, so that it penetrated his innermost soul. Involuntarily, the thought passed through his mind. "Is she really an old woman?" "Ah, I can go no farther," she said in a faint voice, and sank to the earth. He knelt beside her and looked in her eyes. The dawn was red in the sky, and in the distance glimmered the gilt domes of the churches of Kiev. Before him lay a beautiful maiden with thick, dishevelled hair and long eyelashes. Unconsciously she had stretched out her white, bare arms, and her tear-filled eyes gazed at the sky. Thomas trembled like an aspen leaf. Sympathy and a strange feeling of excitement and a hitherto unknown fear overpowered him. He began to run with all his might. His heart beat violently, and he could not explain to himself what a strange new feeling had seized him. He did not wish to return to the village, but hastened towards Kiev, thinking all the way as he went of his weird, unaccountable adventure. There were hardly any students left in the town. They were all scattered about the country and had either taken tutors' posts or simply lived without occupation, for at the farms in Little Russia one can live comfortably and at ease without paying a farthing. The great half-decayed building in which the seminary was established was completely empty, and however much the philosopher searched in all its corners for a piece of lard and bread, he could not find even one of the hard biscuits which the seminarists were in the habit of hiding. But the philosopher found a means of extricating himself from his difficulties by making friends with a certain young widow in the marketplace who sold ribbons, etc. The same evening, he found himself being stuffed with cakes and fowl. In fact, it is impossible to say how many things were placed before him on a little table in an arbor shaded by cherry trees. Later on the same evening, the philosopher was to be seen in an ale-house. He lay on a bench, smoked his pipe in his usual way, and threw the Jewish publican a gold piece. He had a jug of ale standing before him, looked on all who went in and out in a cold-blooded, self-satisfied way, and thought no more of his strange adventure. About this time, a report spread about that the daughter of a rich colonel, whose estate lay about 50 versts distant from Kiev, had returned home one day from a walk in a quite broken-down condition. She had scarcely enough strength to reach her father's house. Now she lay dying, and had expressed a wish that for 3 days after her death the prayers for the dead should be recited by a Kiev seminarist named Thomas Brutus. This fact was communicated to the philosopher by the rector of the seminary himself, who sent for him to his room and told him that he must start at once, as a rich colonel had sent his servants and a kibitka for him. The philosopher trembled and was seized by an uncomfortable feeling which he could not define. He had a gloomy foreboding that some evil was about to befall him. Without knowing why, he declared that he did not wish to go. "Listen, Thomas," said the rector, who under certain circumstances spoke very politely to his pupils. "I have no idea of asking you whether you wish to go or not. I only tell you that if you think of disobeying, I will have you so soundly flogged on the back with young birch rods that you need not think of having a bath for a long time." The philosopher scratched the back of his head and went out silently, intending to make himself scarce at the first opportunity. Lost in thought, he descended the steep flight of steps which led to the courtyard, thickly planted with poplars. There he remained standing for a moment, and heard quite distinctly the rector giving orders in a loud voice to his steward, and to another person, probably one of the messengers sent by the colonel. "Thank your master for the peeled barley and the eggs," said the rector, "and tell him that as soon as the books which he mentions in his note are ready, I will send them. I have already given them to a clerk to be copied. And don't forget to remind your master that he has some excellent fish, especially prime sturgeon, in his ponds. He might send me some when he has the opportunity, as here in the market the fish are bad and dear. And you, Jantuch, give the colonel's man a glass of brandy. And mind you tie up the philosopher, or he will show you a clean pair of heels." "Listen to the scoundrel," thought the philosopher. "He has smelt a rat, the long-legged stork." He descended into the courtyard and beheld there a kibitka, which he at first took for a barn on wheels. It was, in fact, as roomy as a kiln, so that bricks might have been made inside it. It was one of those remarkable Krakow vehicles in which Jews travelled from town to town in scores, wherever they thought they would find a market. 6 stout, strong, though somewhat elderly Cossacks were standing by it. Their gold-braided coats of fine cloth showed that their master was rich and of some importance, and certain little scars testified to their valor on the battlefield. "What can I do?" thought the philosopher. "There is no escaping one's destiny." So he stepped up to the Cossacks and said, "Good day, comrades." "Welcome, Mr. Philosopher," some of them answered. "Well, I am to travel with you. It is a magnificent vehicle," he continued as he got into it. "If there were only musicians present, one might dance in it." "Yes, it is a roomy carriage," said one of the Cossacks, taking his seat by the coachman. The latter had tied a cloth round his head, as he had already found an opportunity of pawning his cap in the ale-house. The other 5, with the philosopher, got into the capacious kibitka and sat upon sacks which were filled with all sorts of articles purchased in the city. "I should like to know," said the philosopher, If this equipage were laden with salt or iron, how many horses would be required to draw it? Yes, said the Cossack, who sat by the coachman after thinking a short time, it would require a good many horses. After giving this satisfactory answer, the Cossack considered himself entitled to remain silent for the whole of the rest of the journey. The philosopher would gladly have found out who the colonel was and what sort of a character he had. He was also curious to know about his daughter, who had returned home in such a strange way and now lay dying, and whose destiny seemed to be mingled with his own, and wanted to know the sort of life that was lived in the colonel's house. But the Cossacks were probably philosophers like himself, for in answer to his inquiries they only blew clouds of tobacco and settled themselves more comfortably on their sacks. Meanwhile, one of them addressed to the coachman on the box a brief command. "Keep your eyes open, Overko, you old sleepy head, and when you come to the ale-house on the road to Chukralov, don't forget to pull up and wake me and the other fellows if we are asleep." Then he began to snore pretty loud. But in any case, his admonition was quite superfluous, for scarcely had the enormous equipage begun to approach the aforesaid ale-house than they all cried with one mouth, "Halt! Halt!" Besides this, Overko's horse was accustomed to stop outside every inn of its own accord. In spite of the intense July heat, they all got out and entered a low, dirty room where a Jewish innkeeper received them in a friendly way as old acquaintances. He brought in the skirt of his long coat some sausages and laid them on the table, where, though forbidden by the Talmud, they looked very seductive. All sat down at table, and it was not long before each of the guests had an earthenware jug standing in front of him. The philosopher Thomas had to take part in the feast, and as the little Russians, when they are intoxicated, always begin to kiss each other or to weep, the whole room soon began to echo with demonstrations of affection. Come here, spirit, let me embrace thee. Come here, Dorosh, let me press you to my heart." One Cossack, with a grey moustache, the eldest of them all, leant his head on his hand and began to weep bitterly, because he was an orphan and alone in God's wide world. Another tall, loquacious man did his best to comfort him, saying, "Don't weep, for God's sake, don't weep, for over there, God knows best." The Cossack, who had been addressed as Dorosh, was full of curiosity, and addressed many questions to the philosopher Thomas. "I should like to know," he said, "what you learn in your seminary. Do you learn the same things as the deacon reads to us in church, or something else?" "Don't ask," said the consoler. "Let them learn what they like. God knows what is to happen. God knows everything." "No, I will know," answered Dorosh. "I will know what is written in their books. Perhaps it is something quite different from that in the deacon's book." "Oh, good heavens," said the other, "why all this talk? It is God's will, and one cannot change God's arrangements. But I will know everything that is written. I will enter the seminary too, by heaven I will. Do you think perhaps I could not learn? I will learn everything, everything." "Oh, heavens!" exclaimed the consoler, and let his head sink on the table, for he could no longer hold it upright. The other Cossacks talked about the nobility, and why there was a moon in the sky. When the philosopher Thomas saw the state they were in, he determined to profit by it, and to make his escape. In the first place, he turned to the grey-headed Cossack, who was lamenting the loss of his parents. "But, little uncle," he said to him, "why do you weep so? I too am an orphan. Let me go, children. Why do you want me?" "Let him go," said some of them. "He is an orphan. Let him go where he likes." They were about to take him outside themselves, when the one who had displayed a special thirst for knowledge stopped them, saying, "No, I want to talk with him about the seminary. I am going to the seminary myself." Moreover, it was not yet certain whether the philosopher could have executed his project of flight, for when he tried to rise from his chair, He felt as though his feet were made of wood, and he began to see such a number of doors leading out of the room that it would have been difficult for him to have found the right one. It was not till evening that the company remembered that they must continue their journey. They crowded into the kibitka, whipped up the horses, and struck up a song, the words and sense of which were hard to understand. During a great part of the night, they wandered about, having lost the road, which they ought to have been able to find blindfolded. At last they drove down a steep descent into a valley, and the philosopher noticed, by the sides of the road, hedges behind which he caught glimpses of small trees and house roofs. All these belonged to the colonel's estate. It was already long past midnight. The sky was dark, though little stars glimmered here and there. No light was to be seen in any of the houses. They drove into a large courtyard, while the dogs barked. On all sides were barns and cottages with thatched roofs. Just opposite the gateway was a house, which was larger than the others, and seemed to be the colonel's dwelling. The kibitka stopped before a small barn, and the travellers hastened into it and laid themselves down to sleep. The philosopher, however, attempted to look at the exterior of the house, but rub his eyes as he might, he could distinguish nothing. The house seemed to turn into a bear, and the chimney into the rector of the seminary. Then he gave it up and lay down to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, the whole house was in commotion. The young lady had died during the night. The servants ran hither and thither in a distracted state. The old women wept and lamented, and a number of curious people gazed through the enclosure into the courtyard as though there was something special to be seen. The philosopher began now to inspect the locality and the buildings, which he had not been able to do during the night. The colonel's house was one of those low, small buildings, such as used formerly to be constructed in Russia. It was thatched with straw. A small, high-peaked gable, with a window shaped like an eye, was painted all over with blue and yellow flowers and red crescent moons. It rested on little oaken pillars, which were round above the middle, hexagonal below, and whose capitals were adorned with quaint carvings. Under this gable was a small staircase with seats at the foot of it on either side. The walls of the house were supported by similar pillars. Before the house stood a large pear tree of pyramidal shape, whose leaves incessantly trembled. A double row of buildings formed a broad street leading up to the colonel's house. Behind the barns, near the entrance gate, stood 2 three-cornered wine houses, also thatched with straw. Each of the stone walls had a door in it and was covered with all kinds of paintings. On one was represented a Cossack sitting on a barrel and swinging a large pitcher over his head. It bore the inscription, "I will drink all that." Elsewhere were painted large and small bottles, a beautiful girl, a running horse, a pipe, and a drum bearing the words, "Wine is the Cossack's joy." In the loft of one of the barns, one saw through a huge round window a drum and some trumpets. At the gate there stood 2 cannons. All this showed that the colonel loved a cheerful life, and the whole place often rang with sounds of merriment. Before the gate were 2 windmills, and behind the house gardens sloped away. Through the treetops, the dark chimneys of the peasants' houses were visible. The whole village lay on a broad, even plateau in the middle of a mountain slope which culminated in a steep summit on the north side. When seen from below, it looked still steeper. Here and there on the top, the irregular stems of the thick steppe brooms showed in dark relief against the blue sky. The bare clay soil made a melancholy impression, worn as it was into deep furrows by rainwater. On the same slope there stood 2 cottages, and over one of them a huge apple tree spread its branches. The roots were supported by small props, whose interstices were filled with mould. The apples, which were blown off by the wind, rolled down to the courtyard below. A road wound round the mountain to the village. When the philosopher looked at this steep slope and remembered his journey of the night before, he came to the conclusion that either the colonel's horses were very sagacious or that the Cossacks must have very strong heads as they ventured, even when the worse for drink, on such a road with the huge kibitka. When the philosopher turned and looked in the opposite direction, he saw quite another picture. The village reached down to the plain. Meadows stretched away to an immense distance, their bright green growing gradually dark. Far away, about 20 versts off, many other villages were visible. To the right of these meadows were chains of hills, and in the remote distance one saw the Dnieper shimmer and sparkle like a mirror of steel. "What a splendid country," said the philosopher to himself. "It must be fine to live here. One could catch fish in the Dnieper and in the ponds and shoot and snare partridges and bustards. There must be quantities here. Much fruit might be dried here and sold in the town, or better still, brandy might be distilled from it, for fruit brandy is the best of all. But what prevents me thinking of my escape after all?" Behind the hedge, he saw a little path which was almost entirely concealed by the high grass of the steppe. The philosopher approached it mechanically, meaning at first to walk a little along it, unobserved, and then quite quietly to gain the open country behind the peasants' houses. Suddenly he felt the pressure of a fairly heavy hand on his shoulder. Behind him stood the same old Cossack who yesterday had so bitterly lamented the death of his father and mother and his own loneliness. "You are giving yourself useless trouble, Mr. Philosopher, if you think you can escape from us," he said. "One cannot run away here, and besides, the roads are too bad for walkers. Come to the colonel. He has been waiting for you for some time in his room." "Yes, of course. What are you talking about?" "I will come with the greatest pleasure," said the philosopher, and followed the Cossack. The colonel was an elderly man. His moustache was grey, and his face wore the signs of deep sadness. He sat in his room by a table with his head propped on both hands. He seemed about 55, but his attitude of utter despair and the pallor on his face showed that his heart had been suddenly broken, and that all his former cheerfulness had forever disappeared. When Thomas entered with the Cossack, he answered their deep bows with a slight inclination of the head. "Who are you? Whence do you come? And what is your profession, my good man?" asked the colonel in an even voice, neither friendly nor austere. "I am a student of philosophy. My name is Thomas Brutus." "And who was your father?" "I don't know, sir." "And your mother?" "I don't know either. I know that I must have had a mother, but who she was and where she lived, by heavens, I do not know." The colonel was silent and seemed for a moment lost in thought. "Where did you come to know my daughter?" "I do not know her, gracious sir. I declare I do not know her." "Why then has she chosen you and no one else to offer up prayers for her?" The philosopher shrugged his shoulders. "God only knows. It is a well-known fact that grand people often demand things which the most learned man cannot comprehend. And does not the proverb say, 'Dance, devil, as the Lord commands'? Aren't you talking nonsense, Mr. Philosopher? May the lightning strike me on the spot if I lie." "If she had only lived a moment longer," said the colonel sadly, "then I had certainly found out everything. She said, 'Let no one offer up prayers for me, but send father at once to the seminary in Kiev for the student Thomas Brutus. He shall pray 3 nights running for my sinful soul. He knows.' But what he really knows, she never said. The poor dove could speak no more, and died. Good man, you are probably well known for your sanctity and devout life, and she has perhaps heard of you." "What? Of me?" said the philosopher, and took a step backward in amazement. "I and sanctity!" he exclaimed, and stared at the colonel. "God help us, gracious sir, what are you saying? It was only last Holy Thursday that I paid a visit to the tart shop." "Well, she must at any rate have had some reason for making the arrangement, and you must begin your duties today. I should like to remark to your honour, naturally everyone who knows the Holy Scripture at all can in his measure, but I believe it would be better on this occasion to send for a deacon or subdeacon. They are learned people, and they know exactly what is to be done. I have not got a good voice, nor any official standing. You may say what you like, but I shall carry out all my dove's wishes. If you read the prayers for her 3 nights through in the proper way, I will reward you, and if not, I advise the devil himself not to oppose me." The colonel spoke the last words in such an emphatic way that the philosopher quite understood them. "Follow me," said the colonel. They went into the hall. The colonel opened a door which was opposite his own. The philosopher remained for a few minutes in the hall in order to look about him. Then he stepped over the threshold with a certain nervousness. The whole floor of the room was covered with red cloth. In a corner under the icons of the saints, on a table covered with a gold-bordered velvet cloth, lay the body of the girl. Tall candles, round which were wound branches of the kalina, stood at her head and feet, and burned dimly in the broad daylight. The face of the dead was not to be seen, as the inconsolable father sat before his daughter with his back turned to the philosopher. The words which the latter overheard filled him with a certain fear. "I do not mourn, my daughter, that in the flower of your age you have prematurely left the earth to my grief. But I mourn, my dove, that I do not know my deadly enemy who caused your death. Had I only known that anyone could even conceive the idea of insulting you or of speaking a disrespectful word to you, I swear by heaven he would never have seen his children again if he had been as old as myself, nor his father and mother if he had been young, and I would have thrown his corpse to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the steppe. But woe is me, my flower, my dove, my light. I will spend the remainder of my life without joy, and wipe the bitter tears which flow out of my old eyes, while my enemy will rejoice and laugh in secret over the helpless old man." He paused, overpowered by grief, and streams of tears flowed down his cheeks. The philosopher was deeply affected by the sight of such inconsolable sorrow. He coughed gently in order to clear his throat. The colonel turned and signed to him to take his place at the head of the dead girl, before a little prayer desk on which some books lay. "I can manage to hold out for 3 nights, thought the philosopher, and then the colonel will fill both my pockets with ducats." He approached the dead girl, and after coughing once more, began to read, without paying attention to anything else, and firmly resolved not to look at her face. Soon there was deep silence, and he saw that the colonel had left the room. Slowly he turned his head in order to look at the corpse. A violent shudder thrilled through him. Before him lay a form of such beauty as is seldom seen upon earth. It seemed to him that never in a single face had so much intensity of expression and harmony of feature been united. Her brow, soft as snow and pure as silver, seemed to be thinking. The fine, regular eyebrows shadowed proudly the closed eyes, whose lashes gently rested on her cheeks, which seemed to glow with secret longing. Her lips still appeared to smile. But at the same time he saw something in these features which appalled him. A terrible depression seized his heart, as when in the midst of dance and song someone begins to chant a dirge. He felt as though those ruby lips were colored with his own heart's blood. Moreover, her face seemed dreadfully familiar. "The witch!" he cried out, in a voice which sounded strange to himself. Then he turned away and began to read the prayers with white cheeks. It was the witch whom he had killed. 2. When the sun had sunk below the horizon, the corpse was carried into the church. The philosopher supported one corner of the black-draped coffin upon his shoulder and felt an ice-cold shiver run through his body. The colonel walked in front of him with his right hand resting on the edge of the coffin. The wooden church, black with age and overgrown with green lichen, stood quite at the end of the village in gloomy solitude. It was adorned with 3 round cupolas. One saw at the first glance that it had not been used for divine worship for a long time. Lighted candles were standing before almost every icon. The coffin was set down before the altar. The old colonel kissed his dead daughter once more, and then left the church, together with the bearers of the bier, after he had ordered his servants to look after the philosopher and to take him back to the church after supper. The coffin-bearers, when they returned to the house, all laid their hands on the stove. This custom is always observed in Little Russia by those who have seen a corpse. The hunger, which the philosopher now began to feel, caused him for a while to forget the dead girl altogether. Gradually, all the domestics of the house assembled in the kitchen. It was really a kind of club where they were accustomed to gather. Even the dogs came to the door, wagging their tails in order to have bones and offal thrown to them. If a servant was sent on an errand, he always found his way into the kitchen to rest there for a while and to smoke a pipe. All the Cossacks of the establishment lay here during the whole day, on and under the benches. In fact, wherever a place could be found to lie down in. Moreover, everyone was always leaving something behind in the kitchen, his cap or his whip or something of the sort. But the numbers of the club were not complete till the evening. When the groom came in after tying up his horses in the stable, the cowherd had shut up his cows in their stalls, and others collected there who were not usually seen in the daytime. During supper-time, even the tongues of the laziest were set in motion. They talked of all and everything, of the new pair of breeches which someone had ordered for himself, of what might be in the center of the earth, and of the wolf which someone had seen. There were a number of wits in the company, a class which is always represented in Little Russia. The philosopher took his place with the rest in the great circle which sat round the kitchen door in the open air. Soon an old woman with a red cap issued from it, bearing with both hands a large vessel full of hot galutchkis, which she distributed among them. Each drew out of his pocket a wooden spoon or a one-pronged wooden fork. As soon as their jaws began to move a little more slowly and their wolfish hunger was somewhat appeased, they began to talk. The conversation, as might be expected, turned on the dead girl. "Is it true," said a young shepherd, "is it true, though I cannot understand it, that our young mistress had traffic with evil spirits?" "Who, the young lady?" answered Dorosh, whose acquaintance the philosopher had already made in the kibitka. "Yes, she was a regular witch. I can swear that she was a witch." "Hold your tongue, Dorosh," exclaimed another, the one who, during the journey, had played the part of a consoler. "We have nothing to do with that. May God be merciful to her. One ought not to talk of such things." But Dorosh was not at all inclined to be silent. He had just visited the wine cellar with the steward on important business, and having stooped 2 or 3 times over 1 or 2 casks, he had returned in a very cheerful and loquacious mood. "Why do you ask me to be silent?" he answered. "She has ridden on my own shoulders, I swear she has." "Say, uncle," asked the young shepherd, "are there signs by which to recognize a sorceress?" "No, there are not," answered Dorosh. "Even if you knew the Psalter by heart, you could not recognize one." "Yes, Dorosh, it is possible. Don't talk such nonsense," retorted the former consoler. "It is not for nothing that God has given each some special peculiarity. The learned maintain that every witch has a little tail." "Every old woman is a witch," said a grey-headed Cossack quite seriously. "Yes, you are a fine lot," retorted the old woman, who entered at that moment with a vessel full of fresh galutchkis. "You are great fat pigs." A self-satisfied smile played round the lips of the old Cossack, whose name was Javtuch, when he found that his remark had touched the old woman on a tender point. The shepherd burst into such a deep and loud explosion of laughter as if two oxen were lowing together. This conversation excited in the philosopher a great curiosity and a wish to obtain more exact information regarding the colonel's daughter. In order to lead the talk back to the subject, he turned to his next neighbor and said, "I should like to know why all the people here think that the young lady was a witch. Has she done harm to anyone, or killed them by witchcraft?" "Yes, there are reports of that kind," answered a man whose face was as flat as a shovel. "Who does not remember the huntsman Mikita, or the—" "What has the huntsman Mikita got to do with it?" asked the philosopher. "Stop! I will tell you the story of Mikita," interrupted Dorosh. "No, I will tell it," said the groom, "for he was my godfather." "I will tell the story of Mikita," said Spirid. "Yes, yes, Spirid shall tell it," exclaimed the whole company, and Spirid began. "You, Mr. Philosopher Thomas, did not know Mikita. Ah, he was an extraordinary man. He knew every dog as though he were his own father. The present huntsman, Mikola, who sits 3 places away from me, is not fit to hold a candle to him, though good enough in his way. But compared to Mikita, he is a mere milksop." "You tell the tale splendidly," exclaimed Dorosh, and nodded as a sign of approval. Spirid continued. "He saw a hare in the field quicker than you can take a pinch of snuff. He only needed to whistle, 'Come here, Razboy! Come here, Bozdraya!' and flew away on his horse like the wind, so that you could not say whether he went quicker than the dog or the dog than he. He could empty a quart-pot of brandy in the twinkling of an eye. Ah, he was a splendid huntsman, only for some time he always had his eyes fixed on the young lady. Either he had fallen in love with her, or she had bewitched him. In short, he went to the dogs. He became a regular old woman. Yes, he became the devil knows what. It is not fitting to relate it." "Very good," remarked Dorosh. "If the young lady only looked at him, he let the reins slip out of his hands, called Bravko instead of Razboy, stumbled, and made all kinds of mistakes. One day, when he was currycombing a horse, the young lady came to him in the stable. 'Listen, Mikita,' she said, 'I should like for once to set my foot on you.' And he, the booby, was quite delighted, and answered, 'Don't only set your foot there, but sit on me altogether.' The young lady lifted her white little foot, and as soon as he saw it, his delight robbed him of his senses. He bowed his neck, the idiot took her feet in both hands, and began to trot about like a horse all over the place. Whither they went, he could not say. He returned more dead than alive, and from that time he wasted away and became as dry as a chip of wood. At last, someone coming into the stable one day found instead of him only a handful of ashes and an empty jug. He had burned completely out. But it must be said, he was a huntsman such as the world cannot match." When Spirid had ended his tale, they all began to vie with one another in praising the deceased huntsman. "And have you heard the story of Chepchicha?" asked Dorosh, turning to Thomas. "No." "Ha! Ha! One sees they don't teach you much in your seminary. Well, listen. We have here in our village a Cossack called Cheptun, a fine fellow. Sometimes, indeed, he amuses himself by stealing and lying without any reason. But he is a fine fellow for all that. His house is not far away from here. One evening, just about this time, Cheptun and his wife went to bed after they had finished their day's work. Since it was fine weather, Chepchicha went to sleep in the courtyard, and Cheptun in the house. No, I mean Chepchicha went to sleep in the house on a bench, and Cheptun outside. No, Chepchicha didn't go to sleep on a bench but on the ground, interrupted the old woman who stood at the door. Dorosh looked at her, then at the ground, then again at her, and said after a pause, "If I tore your dress off your back before all these people, it wouldn't look pretty." The rebuke was effectual. The old woman was silent and did not interrupt again. Dorosh continued. In the cradle which hung in the middle of the room lay a 1-year-old child. I do not know whether it was a boy or a girl. Chepchicha had lain down and heard on the other side of the door a dog scratching and howling loud enough to frighten anyone. She was afraid, for women are such simple folk that if one puts out one's tongue at them behind the door in the dark, their hearts sink into their boots. But, she thought to herself, I must give this cursed dog one on the snout to stop his howling. So she seized the poker and opened the door. But hardly had she done so than the dog rushed between her legs straight to the cradle. Then Chepchicha saw that it was not a dog, but the young lady, and if it had only been the young lady as she knew her, it wouldn't have mattered, but she looked quite blue, and her eyes sparkled like fiery coals. She seized the child, bit its throat, and began to suck its blood. Chepchicha shrieked, "Ah, my darling child!" and rushed out of the room. Then she saw that the house door was shut and rushed up to the attic and sat there, the stupid woman trembling all over. Then the young lady came after her and bit her too, poor fool. The next morning, Cheptun carried his wife, all bitten and wounded, down from the attic, and the next day she died. Such strange things happen in the world. One may wear fine clothes, but that does not matter. A witch is and remains a witch. After telling his story, Dorosh looked around him with a complacent air and cleaned out his pipe with his little finger in order to fill it again. The story of the witch had made a deep impression on all, and each of them had something to say about her. One had seen her come to the door of his house in the form of a hayrick. From others, she had stolen their caps or their pipes. She had cut off the hairplaits of many girls in the village and drunk whole pints of the blood of others. At last the whole company observed that they had gossiped over their time, for it was already night. All looked for a sleeping place, some in the kitchen and others in the barn or the courtyard. "Now, Mr. Thomas, it is time that we go to the dead," said the grey-headed Cossack, turning to the philosopher. All four, Spirid, Dorosh, the old Cossack, and the philosopher, betook themselves to the church, keeping off with their whips the wild dogs who roamed about the roads in great numbers and bit the sticks of passers-by in sheer malice. Although the philosopher had seized the opportunity of fortifying himself beforehand with a stiff glass of brandy, yet he felt a certain secret fear which increased as he approached the church, which was lit up within. The strange tales he had heard had made a deep impression on his imagination. They had passed the thick hedges and trees, and the country became more open. At last they reached the small enclosure round the church. Behind it there were no more trees, but a huge empty plain, dimly visible in the darkness. The three Cossacks ascended the steep steps with Thomas and entered the church. Here they left the philosopher, expressing their hope that he would successfully accomplish his duties, and locked him in as their master had ordered. He was left alone. At first he yawned, then he stretched himself, blew on both hands, and finally looked round him. In the middle of the church stood the black bier. Before the dark pictures of saints burned the candles, whose light only illuminated the icons and cast a faint glimmer into the body of the church. All the corners were in complete darkness. The lofty icons seemed to be of considerable age. Only a little of the original gilt remained on their broken traceries. The faces of the saints had become quite black and looked uncanny. Once more, the philosopher cast a glance around him. "Bother it," said he to himself. "What is there to be afraid about? No living creature can get in, and as for the dead and those who come from the other side, I can protect myself with such effectual prayers that they cannot touch me with the tips of their fingers. There is nothing to fear," he repeated, swinging his arms. "Let us begin the prayers." As he approached one of the side aisles, he noticed 2 packets of candles which had been placed there. That is fine, he thought. I must illuminate the whole church till it is as bright as day. What a pity that one cannot smoke in it. He began to light the candles on all the wall brackets and all the candelabra, as well as those already burning before the holy pictures. Soon, the whole church was brilliantly lit up. Only the darkness in the roof above seemed still denser by contrast, and the faces of the saints peering out of the frames looked as unearthly as before. He approached the bier, looked nervously at the face of the dead girl, could not help shuddering slightly, and involuntarily closed his eyes. What terrible and extraordinary beauty! He turned away and tried to go to one side, but the strange curiosity and peculiar fascination which men feel in moments of fear compelled him to look again and again, though with a similar shudder. And in truth, there was something terrible about the beauty of the dead girl. Perhaps she would not have inspired so much fear had she been less beautiful. But there was nothing ghastly or death-like in the face, which wore rather an expression of life, and it seemed to the philosopher as though she were watching him from under her closed eyelids. He even thought he saw a tear roll from under the eyelash of her right eye, but when it was halfway down her cheek, he saw that it was a drop of blood. He quickly went into one of the stalls, opened his book, and began to read the prayers in a very loud voice in order to keep up his courage. His deep voice sounded strange to himself in the grave-like silence. It aroused no echo in the silent and desolate wooden walls of the church. What is there to be afraid of? He thought to himself. She will not rise from her bier since she fears God's word. She will remain quietly resting. Yes, and what sort of a Cossack should I be if I were afraid? The fact is, I have drunk a little too much. That is why I feel so queer. Let me take a pinch of snuff. It is really excellent, first rate. At the same time, he cast a furtive glance over the pages of the prayer book towards the bier, and involuntarily he said to himself, "There, see? She is getting up. Her head is already above the edge of the coffin." But a death-like silence prevailed. The coffin was motionless, and all the candles shone steadily. It was an awe-inspiring sight, this church lit up at midnight, with the corpse in the midst, and no living soul near but one. The philosopher began to sing in various keys in order to stifle his fears, but every moment he glanced across at the coffin, and involuntarily the question came to his lips, "Suppose she rose up after all?" But the coffin did not move. Nowhere was there the slightest sound nor stir. Not even did a cricket chirp in any corner. There was nothing audible but the slight sputtering of some distant candle or the faint fall of a drop of wax. Suppose she rose up after all? He raised his head. Then he looked round him wildly and rubbed his eyes. Yes, she was no longer lying in the coffin, but sitting upright. He turned away his eyes, but at once looked again, terrified, at the coffin. She stood up. Then she walked with closed eyes through the church, stretching out her arms as though she wanted to seize someone. She now came straight towards him. Full of alarm, he traced with his finger a circle round himself. Then, in a loud voice, he began to recite the prayers and formulas of exorcism which he had learnt from a monk who had often seen witches and evil spirits. She had almost reached the edge of the circle which he had traced, but it was evident that she had not the power to enter it. Her face wore a bluish tint, like that of one who has been several days dead. Thomas had not the courage to look at her, so terrible was her appearance. Her teeth chattered, and she opened her dead eyes, but as in her rage she saw nothing, she turned in another direction and felt with outstretched arms among the pillars and corners of the church in the hope of seizing him. At last she stood still, made a threatening gesture, and then lay down again in the coffin. The philosopher could not recover his self-possession and kept on gazing anxiously at it. Suddenly, it rose from its place and began hurtling about the church with a whizzing sound. At one time it was almost directly over his head, but the philosopher observed that it could not pass over the area of his charmed circle, so he kept on repeating his formulas of exorcism. The coffin now fell with a crash in the middle of the church and remained lying there motionless. The corpse rose again. It had now a greenish-blue color, but at the same moment the distant crowing of a cock was audible, and it lay down again. The philosopher's heart beat violently, and the perspiration poured in streams from his face. But heartened by the crowing of the cock, he rapidly repeated the prayers. As the first light of dawn looked through the windows, there came a deacon and the grey-haired Yavtuk, who acted as sacristan in order to release him. When he had reached the house, he could not sleep for a long time. But at last, weariness overpowered him, and he slept till noon. When he awoke, his experiences of the night appeared to him like a dream. He was given a quart of brandy to strengthen him. At table, he was again talkative and ate a fairly large sucking pig almost without assistance. But nonetheless, he resolved to say nothing of what he had seen, and to all curious questions only returned the answer, "Yes, some wonderful things happened." The philosopher was one of those men who, when they have had a good meal, are uncommonly amiable. He lay down on a bench with his pipe in his mouth, looked blandly at all, and expectorated every minute. But as the evening approached, he became more and more pensive. About supper time, nearly the whole company had assembled in order to play craply. This is a kind of game of skittles in which, instead of bowls, long staves are used, and the winner has the right to ride on the back of his opponent. It provided the spectators with much amusement. Sometimes the groom, a huge man, would clamber on the back of the swineherd, who was slim and short and shrunken. Another time the groom would present his own back, while Dorosh sprang on it shouting, "What a regular ox!" Those of the company who were more staid sat by the threshold of the kitchen. They looked uncommonly serious, smoked their pipes, and did not even smile when the younger ones went into fits of laughter over some joke of the groom or spirit. Thomas vainly attempted to take part in the game. A gloomy thought was firmly fixed like a nail in his head. In spite of his desperate efforts to appear cheerful after supper, fear had overmastered his whole being, and it increased with the growing darkness. "Now, it is time for us to go, Mr. Student," said the grey-haired Cossack, and stood up with Dorosh. "Let us betake ourselves to our work." Thomas was conducted to the church in the same way as on the previous evening. Again he was left alone, and the door was bolted behind him. As soon as he found himself alone, he began to feel in the grip of his fears. He again saw the dark pictures of the saints in their gilt frames, and the black coffin, which stood menacing and silent in the middle of the church. "Never mind," he said to himself. "I am over the first shock. The first time I was frightened, but I am not so at all now. No, not at all." He quickly went into a stall, drew a circle round him with his finger, uttered some prayers and formulas for exorcism, and then began to read the prayers for the dead in a loud voice, and with the fixed resolution not to look up from the book, nor take notice of anything. He did so for an hour, and began to grow a little tired. He cleared his throat, and drew his snuff-box out of his pocket. But before he had taken a pinch, he looked nervously towards the coffin. A sudden chill shot through him. The witch was already standing before him on the edge of the circle, and had fastened her green eyes upon him. He shuddered, looked down at the book, and began to read his prayers and exorcisms aloud. Yet all the while he was aware how her teeth chattered, and how she stretched out her arms to seize him. But when he cast a hasty glance towards her, He saw that she was not looking in his direction, and it was clear that she could not see him. Then she began to murmur in an undertone, and terrible words escaped her lips, words that sounded like the bubbling of boiling pitch. The philosopher did not know their meaning, but he knew that they signified something terrible and were intended to counteract his exorcisms. After she had spoken, a stormy wind arose in the church, and there was a noise like the rushing of many birds. He heard the noise of their wings and claws as they flapped against and scratched at the iron bars of the church windows. There were also violent blows on the church door, as if someone were trying to break it in pieces. The philosopher's heart beat violently. He did not dare to look up, but continued to read the prayers without a pause. At last, there was heard in the distance the shrill sound of a cock's crow. The exhausted philosopher stopped and gave a great sigh of relief. Those who came to release him found him more dead than alive. He had leant his back against the wall and stood motionless, regarding them without any expression in his eyes. They were obliged almost to carry him to the house. He then shook himself, asked for, and drank a quart of brandy. He passed his hand through his hair and said, "There are all sorts of horrors in the world, and such dreadful things happen that—" Here he made a gesture as though to ward off something. All who heard him bent their heads forward in curiosity. Even a small boy, who ran on everyone's errands, stood by with his mouth wide open. Just then, a young woman in a close-fitting dress passed by. She was the old cook's assistant, and very coquettish. She always stuck something in her bodice by way of ornament, a ribbon or a flower, or even a piece of paper if she could find nothing else. "Good day, Thomas," she said as she saw the philosopher. "Dear me, what has happened to you?" she exclaimed, striking her hands together. "Well, what is it, you silly creature? Good heavens, you have grown quite grey." "Yes, so he has," said Spirid, regarding him more closely. "You have grown as grey as our old Javtuk." When the philosopher heard that, he hastened into the kitchen, where he had noticed on the wall a dirty, three-cornered piece of looking-glass. In front of it hung some forget-me-nots, evergreens, and a small garland, a proof that it was the toilette glass of the young coquette. With alarm he saw that it actually was as they had said. His hair was quite grizzled. He sank into a reverie. At last he said to himself, "I will go to the colonel, tell him all, and declare that I will read no more prayers. He must send me back at once to Kiev." With this intention, he turned towards the doorsteps of the colonel's house. The colonel was sitting motionless in his room. His face displayed the same hopeless grief which Thomas had observed on it on his first arrival, only the hollows in his cheeks had deepened. It was obvious that he took very little or no food. A strange paleness made him look almost as though made of marble. "Good day," he said, as he observed Thomas standing, cap in hand, at the door. "Well, how are you getting on? All right?" "Yes, sir, all right. Such hellish things are going on. That one would like to rush away as far as one's feet can carry one." "How so?" "Your daughter, sir. When one considers the matter, she is, of course, of noble descent. No one can dispute that. But don't be angry, and may God grant her eternal rest." "Very well. What about her?" "She is in league with the devil. She inspires one with such dread that all prayers are useless. Pray, pray, it was not for nothing that she sent for you. My dove was troubled about her salvation and wished to expel all evil influences by means of prayer." "I swear, gracious sir, it is beyond my power." "Pray, pray," continued the colonel in the same persuasive tone. "There is only one night more. You are doing a Christian work, and I will reward you richly." "However great your rewards may be, I will not read the prayers any more, sir," said Thomas in a tone of decision. "Listen, philosopher," said the colonel with a menacing air. "I will not allow any objections. In your seminary you may act as you like, but here it won't do. If I have you knouted, it will be somewhat different to the rector's canings. Do you know what a strong conchuk is? Of course I do, said the philosopher in a low voice. A number of them together are insupportable. Yes, I think so too, but you don't know yet how hot my fellows can make it, replied the colonel threateningly. He sprang up, and his face assumed a fierce, despotic expression, betraying the savagery of his nature, which had been only temporarily modified by grief. After the first flogging, they pour on brandy and then repeat it. Go away and finish your work. If you don't obey, you won't be able to stand again, and if you do, you will get 1,000 ducats. That is a devil of a fellow, thought the philosopher to himself, and went out. One can't trifle with him. But wait a little, my friend. I will escape you so cleverly that even your hounds can't find me. He determined, under any circumstances, to run away, and only waited till the hour after dinner arrived, when all the servants were accustomed to take a nap on the hay in the barn, and to snore and puff so loudly that it sounded as if machinery had been set up there. At last the time came. Even Javtuch stretched himself out in the sun and closed his eyes. Tremblingly and on tiptoe, the philosopher stole softly into the garden, whence he thought he could escape more easily into the open country. This garden was generally so choked up with weeds that it seemed admirably adapted for such an attempt. With the exception of a single path used by the people of the house, the whole of it was covered with cherry trees, elder bushes, and tall heath thistles with fibrous red buds. All these trees and bushes had been thickly overgrown with ivy, which formed a kind of roof. Its tendrils reached to the hedge and fell down on the other side in snake-like curves among the small, wild field flowers. Behind the hedge which bordered the garden was a dense mass of wild heather, in which it did not seem probable that anyone would care to venture himself, and the strong, stubborn stems of which seemed likely to baffle any attempt to cut them. As the philosopher was about to climb over the hedge, his teeth chattered, and his heart beat so violently that he felt frightened at it. The skirts of his long cloak seemed to cling to the ground, as though they had been fastened to it by pegs. When he had actually got over the hedge, he seemed to hear a shrill voice crying behind him. "Whither? Whither?" He jumped into the heather and began to run, stumbling over old roots and treading on unfortunate moles. When he had emerged from the heather, he saw that he still had a wide field to cross, behind which was a thick, thorny underwood. This, according to his calculation, must stretch as far as the road leading to Kiev, and if he reached it, he would be safe. Accordingly, he ran over the field and plunged into the thorny copse. Every sharp thorn he encountered tore a fragment from his coat. Then he reached a small open space. In the center of it stood a willow whose branches hung down to the earth, and close by flowed a clear spring, bright as silver. The first thing the philosopher did was to lie down and drink eagerly, for he was intolerably thirsty. "Splendid water," he said, wiping his mouth. "This is a good place to rest in." "No, better run, father. Perhaps we're being followed," said a voice immediately behind him. Thomas started and turned. Before him stood Javtuch. "This devil of a Javtuch," he thought. "I should like to seize him by the feet and smash his hangdog face against the trunk of a tree." "Why did you go round such a long way?" continued Javtuch. "You had much better have chosen the path by which I came. It leads directly by the stable. Besides, it is a pity about your coat. Such splendid cloth. How much did it cost an ell? Well, we have had a long enough walk. It is time to go home." The philosopher followed Javtuch in a very depressed state. "Now the accursed witch will attack me in earnest," he thought. "But what have I really to fear? Am I not a Cossack? I have read the prayers for 2 nights already. With God's help, I will get through the 3rd night also. It is plain that the witch must have a terrible load of guilt upon her, else the evil one would not help her so much." Feeling somewhat encouraged by these reflections, he returned to the courtyard and asked Dorosh, who sometimes, by the steward's permission, had access to the wine cellar, to fetch him a small bottle of brandy. The two friends sat down before a barn and drank a pretty large one. Suddenly, the philosopher jumped up and said, "I want musicians! Bring some musicians!" But without waiting for them, he began to dance the tropak in the courtyard. He danced till tea time, and the servants, who, as is usual in such cases, had formed a small circle round him, grew at last tired of watching him, and went away saying, "By heavens, the man can dance!" Finally, the philosopher lay down in the place where he had been dancing and fell asleep. It was necessary to pour a bucket of cold water on his head to wake him up for supper. At the meal, he enlarged on the topic of what a Cossack ought to be and how he should not be afraid of anything in the world. "It is time," said Javtuch. "Let us go." "I wish I could put a lighted match to your tongue," thought the philosopher. Then he stood up and said, "Let us go." On their way to the church, the philosopher kept looking round him on all sides and tried to start a conversation with his companions. But both Javtuch and Dorosh remained silent. It was a weird night. In the distance, wolves howled continually, and even the barking of the dogs had something unearthly about it. "That doesn't sound like wolves howling, but something else," remarked Dorosh. Javtuch still kept silence, and the philosopher did not know what answer to make. They reached the church and walked over the old wooden planks, whose rotten condition showed how little the lord of the manor cared about God and his soul. Javtuch and Dorosh left the philosopher alone, as on the previous evenings. There was still the same atmosphere of menacing silence in the church, in the center of which stood the coffin with the terrible witch inside it. "I am not afraid, by heavens, I am not afraid," he said, and after drawing a circle round himself as before, he began to read the prayers and exorcisms. An oppressive silence prevailed. The flickering candles filled the church with their clear light. The philosopher turned one page after another and noticed that he was not reading what was in the book. Full of alarm, he crossed himself and began to sing a hymn. This calmed him somewhat, and he resumed his reading, turning the pages rapidly as he did so. Suddenly, in the midst of the sepulchral silence, the iron lid of the coffin sprang open with a jarring noise, and the dead witch stood up. She was this time still more terrible in aspect than at first. Her teeth chattered loudly, and her lips, through which poured a stream of dreadful curses, moved convulsively. A whirlwind arose in the church. The icons of the saints fell on the ground, together with the broken window panes. The door was wrenched from its hinges, and a huge mass of monstrous creatures rushed into the church, which became filled with the noise of beating wings and scratching claws. All these creatures flew and crept about, seeking for the philosopher, from whose brain the last fumes of intoxication had vanished. He crossed himself ceaselessly and uttered prayer after prayer, hearing all the time the whole unclean swarm rustling about him and brushing him with the tips of their wings. He had not the courage to look at them. He only saw one uncouth monster standing by the wall with long, shaggy hair and two flaming eyes. Over him, something hung in the air, which looked like a gigantic bladder covered with countless crabs' claws and scorpions' stings, and with black clods of earth hanging from it. All these monsters stared about seeking him, but they couldn't find him, since he was protected by his sacred circle. "Bring the V! Bring the V!" cried the witch. A sudden silence followed. The howling of wolves was heard in the distance, and soon heavy footsteps resounded through the church. Thomas looked up furtively and saw that an ungainly human figure with crooked legs was being led into the church. He was quite covered with black soil, and his hands and feet resembled knotted roots. He trod heavily and stumbled at every step. His eyelids were of enormous length. With terror, Thomas saw that his face was of iron. They led him in by the arms and placed him near Thomas's circle. "Raise my eyelids! I can't see anything," said the V, in a dull, hollow voice, and they all hastened to help in doing so. "Don't look," an inner voice warned the philosopher, but he could not restrain from looking. "There he is!" exclaimed the V, pointing an iron finger at him, and all the monsters rushed on him at once. Struck dumb with terror, he sank to the ground and died. At that moment, there sounded a cock's crow for the second time. The earth spirits had not heard the first one. In alarm, they hurried to the windows and the door to get out as quickly as possible. But it was too late. They all remained hanging, as though fastened to the door and the windows. When the priest came, he stood amazed at such a desecration of God's house and did not venture to read prayers there. The church remained standing as it was, with the monsters hanging on the windows and the door. Gradually, it became overgrown with creepers, bushes, and wild heather, and no one can discover it now. When the report of this event reached Kiev, and the theologian Kalava heard what a fate had overtaken the philosopher Thomas, he sank for a whole hour into deep reflection. He had greatly altered of late. After finishing his studies, he had become bell-ringer of one of the chief churches in the city, and he always appeared with a bruised nose because the belfry staircase was in a ruinous condition. "Have you heard what has happened to Thomas?" said Tiberius Gorobets, who had become a philosopher and now wore a moustache. "Yes, God had appointed it so," answered the bell-ringer. "Let us go to the ale-house. We will drink a glass to his memory." The young philosopher, who, with the enthusiasm of a novice, had made such full use of his privileges as a student that his breeches and coat, and even his cap, reeked of brandy and tobacco, agreed readily to the proposal. "He was a fine fellow, Thomas," said the bell-ringer, as the limping innkeeper set the third jug of beer before him. "A splendid fellow, and lost his life for nothing." "I know why he perished," said Gorobets, "because he was afraid. If he had not feared her, the witch could have done nothing to him. One ought to cross oneself incessantly and spit exactly on her tail, and then not the least harm can happen. I know all about it, for here, in Kiev, all the old women in the marketplace are witches." The bell-ringer nodded assent, but being aware that he could not say any more, he got up cautiously and went out, swaying to the right and left, in order to find a hiding place in the thick steppe grass outside the town. At the same time, in accordance with his old habits, he did not forget to steal an old boot sole which lay on the alehouse bench. The End.